What if the most cataclysmic fire in human memory wasn't meant to be clearly remembered? Imagine its echoes lingering not only in crumbling ruins, but also in fragmented clay tablets, half-erased words, and stories whispered as cautionary tales rather than precise historical records. Was there a deliberate obscuring, a collective amnesia surrounding an event too terrible to face directly? Somewhere in the hazy realm between myth and tangible memory, two cities are consumed by an inferno of such unparalleled intensity that even time itself seems to falter. All that remains is an unnerving silence and questions that no one was ever intended to voice. Tonight, we embark on a slow, deliberate journey through that silence, not seeking definitive answers, but rather to truly feel the crushing weight of what was irrevocably lost. We will follow the barely perceptible traces that still whisper beneath the polished surface of recorded history. Long before the names Sodom and Gomorrah became synonymous with moral depravity, before they were etched into the collective consciousness as symbols of divine retribution, there existed simply a landscape, a place of quiet beauty, fertile lands, and the gentle rhythm of life breathing beneath a sky that had not yet learned the devastating power of fire. The southern Levant, in those distant days, was characterized by shallow, shimmering waters and salt-rich plains. Rivers meandered and spread, nurturing early settlements that clung to the margins of survival. The earth itself held memories. The relentless surge of floods, the parched desperation of droughts, the earth-shattering violence of tremors. And it also remembered fire, though its memory was buried deep, unspoken, almost forbidden. The oldest stories, the foundational myths, do not begin with stark scenes of destruction. Instead, they commence with a profound sense of absence, with inexplicable gaps where continuity should have flowed unbroken. Examining the archaeological record of the Dead Sea Basin, we find distinct layers where human occupation abruptly ceases. Not a gradual decline, not a slow and predictable fading, but a sudden, jarring halt, as if a conversation had been brutally cut short mid-sentence. Above these anomalous layers, telltale signs appear. Ash deposits, melted minerals, grains of shocked quartz, undeniable evidence that intense heat once moved with terrifying speed, far exceeding human capabilities for escape. These traces are deeply unsettling. They refuse to fit neatly into our comfortable, linear narratives of slow and steady cultural evolution. They point to something sudden, overwhelming, and utterly indiscriminate in its devastation. And when the earth stubbornly refuses to offer a complete and coherent explanation, the human mind inevitably turns elsewhere, to ancient texts, to memories carefully encoded as myth, to records not carved in enduring stone, but meticulously pressed into fragile clay. Far to the east, beyond vast deserts and imposing mountain ranges, scribes in ancient Mesopotamia painstakingly pressed reeds into soft, wet clay tablets. They wrote of powerful kings, of catastrophic floods, of gods who descended from the heavens wreathed in fire. These were not merely moral lessons in the modern sense. They were desperate attempts to stabilize memory, to fix the fleeting image of catastrophe into the permanence of language before it slipped away entirely. Within some of these tablets, fire is not employed as a mere metaphor. It is described as a devastating force that scours entire cities from the face of the earth, leaving not a single shadow standing, transforming day into something far brighter and far more terrifying than the darkest night. These accounts do not explicitly name Sodom or Gomorrah. They don't need to. Instead, they speak of a blinding divine radiance that utterly overturns the plains, of relentless winds that carry scorching heat rather than life-giving relief, of traumatized survivors who wander aimlessly into unfamiliar lands, burdened with knowledge that they cannot adequately explain without sounding like raving madmen. The language used is remarkably restrained, almost weary, as if the scribes themselves were acutely aware of the potential danger of awakening something dormant by naming it too directly. One particularly chilling tablet describes a storm of fire descending not like gentle rain, but like a voiceless, implacable judgment. Another speaks of a city that existed, and then abruptly ceased to exist, reduced to a haunting memory faster than morning could even begin to take shape. The descriptions are fragmented and broken, as though even the clay itself resisted holding the full, unadulterated horror of what transpired. Geologists, centuries later, would begin to notice similarly disturbing fractures in the earth itself. Salt formations twisted and warped unnaturally. Sediment layers fused together as if briefly liquefied by unimaginable heat. The cumulative evidence pointed to temperatures far exceeding those generated by ordinary fires or even volcanic activity. Some researchers proposed meteor airbursts as a possible explanation, while others suggested seismic releases igniting subterranean gases. Each explanation carried a certain weight, a degree of plausibility, yet none felt entirely complete on its own. What lingers uneasily in the mind is the unsettling convergence of evidence. The echoes between ancient texts and the physical terrain, resonating across millennia, not as definitive proof, but as a profound and undeniable resonance, the kind that settles deep into the body, bypassing the intellect altogether. In the biblical tradition, the destruction of Sodom and Gomorrah is transformed into a stark moral tableau. Fire rains down from heaven, cities are judged for their wickedness, and a solitary pillar of salt stands as a perpetual warning. But the earlier layers of the story are markedly different, quieter, less certain, imbued with the raw texture of half-remembered experience rather than rigid doctrine. There's a powerful sense that something truly happened, and that the moralizing interpretation was assigned afterward, applied like a hastily placed bandage over a gaping wound whose true depth no one dared to examine too closely. The pillar of salt itself is incredibly telling. Salt is what remains when water evaporates, leaving behind both preservation and stark desolation in equal measure. In the Dead Sea region, natural salt pillars are formed over time by erosion and the relentless forces of nature. But to imagine a human figure frozen in time, transfixed into a pillar of salt, suggests far more than simple punishment. It evokes a feeling of profound shock, of utter stillness. The body caught suspended between movement and complete annihilation. Ancient Near Eastern cultures were no strangers to catastrophe. Devastating floods, raging fires, and deadly plagues were all woven into the fabric of their cosmologies. Yet certain disasters were treated with a distinct kind of reverence, spoken of obliquely, encased in elaborate ritual language, and surrounded by strict taboos. Fire that fell from the sky belonged squarely within this category. It was not merely destructive. It was profoundly destabilizing. It challenged the perceived boundary between the natural world and the realm of the divine. Sumerian texts often frame such events as necessary resets, pivotal moments when the gods wiped the tablet clean, offering humanity a chance to begin anew. Civilization, in this view, is provisional, allowed but never guaranteed. When humans grow too numerous, too noisy, or too self-assured, the delicate balance is disrupted. Fire then becomes a corrective force, neither inherently evil nor intrinsically good, but simply final. If such a reset occurred in the Levant, its memory may have traveled far and wide, carried by terrified refugees, itinerant traders, and captive peoples transported west and south, reshaped and reinterpreted with each retelling. By the time the story reached later Hebrew authors, it had evolved into a cautionary lesson, a stark warning meticulously etched into the very foundations of theology rather than simply remembered as a geographical event. But beneath the surface of that moralizing lesson, the original primal fear still trembles, the deep-seated fear of a sky that can betray, of heat that does not behave as fire should, of a cataclysmic moment so intense that it erases not only buildings and infrastructure, but also humanity's fundamental confidence in the future itself. Modern science approaches these ancient stories with a mixture of caution and skepticism. Yet even scientific skepticism has begun to soften around the edges. Recent excavations at archaeological sites like Tal el Hammam reveal distinct destruction layers meticulously dated to around the Middle Bronze Age, timelines that were long dismissed as merely symbolic. At these sites, pottery is found vitrified, transformed into glass by intense heat. Bricks are melted on one side only, as if exposed to a directional blast of immense force. Human remains are strikingly scarce, suggesting not a slow and orderly abandonment of the city, but instant and complete obliteration. Still, no ancient inscription definitively reads, "Here was Sodom," And perhaps that very absence is the key to understanding the enduring power of the story. Names anchor events in time and space. Remove the name, and the event becomes infinitely harder to contain, far more dangerous in its implications. It seeps into neighboring cultures, subtly changes shape, and survives precisely because it is never definitively pinned down. The Sumerian scribes, perhaps, intuitively understood this fundamental principle. Their apparent restraint feels deeply intentional. They wrote enough to preserve the memory, but deliberately not enough to actively invite its repetition. Fire, once described too vividly, too explicitly, might somehow return. As this part of our journey draws to a close, the image that lingers most powerfully is not one of roaring flames, but rather of the profound and unsettling silence that descends after them. The image of a plain emptied not only of all life, but also of all certainty. Somewhere in the vast expanse between ancient Mesopotamia and the Dead Sea, memory fractured. What survived did so in whispers, in subtle clay impressions, in uneasy gaps in the archaeological record that stubbornly refused to remain buried. And if the first layer of this story is one of profound absence, then perhaps the next lies in asking a far more fundamental question. Why are some memories carefully preserved as sacred commandments, while others are deliberately allowed to dissolve into ash and be forgotten? Absence, once consciously noticed, begins to draw the eye everywhere. It hides not only in the soil beneath our feet, but also in the very structure of language itself. Certain words appear frequently in ancient records, and then suddenly and inexplicably thin out, as if the scribes themselves hesitated to commit them to the permanent record. In Sumerian and Akkadian texts, fire is usually described in practical terms. Kilns for baking pottery, hearths for warmth and cooking, offerings to the gods. But there exists another kind of fire, described in dramatically different terms. It arrives without any fuel. It leaves no time for prayer or supplication. It does not linger or gradually fade away. And after it passes, the writers grow noticeably cautious and circumspect. Some ancient tablets speak of a blinding brilliance that flattened the land in an instant. Others describe heat that moved with the relentless force of wind, stripping the very skins from walls and transforming fertile fields into lifeless, barren crusts. These are not poetic flourishes, not flights of fancy. They are oddly technical, almost coldly observational, as if the scribes were meticulously recording something that they did not fully comprehend, but also did not dare to embellish or exaggerate in any way. The tone is remarkably restrained and measured, the kind of writing that suggests trauma cautiously remembered rather than myth freely invented. What is particularly striking is not only what is said, but also what is deliberately omitted. The gods responsible for unleashing this destructive force are either unnamed or named only indirectly, using veiled allusions and circumlocutions. There is no extended justification for the catastrophe, no detailed list of specific sins, only the brutal and undeniable consequence. It is as though the elaborate moral framing came later, carefully layered on top of an older, far more frightening memory. The chilling realization that utter destruction can arrive without any explanation whatsoever. In Mesopotamian cosmology, devastating floods are at least intelligible. They arise from excess, from a fundamental imbalance in the natural elements of water and weather. Fire from the sky is something altogether different. It implies a violent intrusion, an event that does not belong to the normal and predictable cycles of the world, something fundamentally external, or at the very least, something that violates every reasonable expectation. And when expectation breaks down so completely, meaning itself becomes inherently unstable. This profound instability may explain why later cultures struggled so mightily to cleanly integrate such a devastating event into their existing narratives. In Hebrew scripture, the destruction of Sodom and Gomorrah is rigidly framed as divine judgment, but the actual mechanism of that judgment remains deliberately vague. Fire and brimstone fall from the sky, yet the source of that fire remains distant, almost abstract. The story moves quickly, as if reluctant to dwell on the stark physics of what actually occurred. The emphasis shifts instead to moral behavior, unquestioning obedience, and the desperate need for escape. Yet, the unsettling physical details stubbornly refuse to disappear entirely. The land becomes permanently inhospitable. The water turns bitter and undrinkable. Vegetation fails to return, leaving behind a barren wasteland. These are environmental aftershocks, not primarily moral ones. They suggest a long-term alteration of the landscape, consistent with exposure to extreme heat and persistent chemical disruption. The Dead Sea, with its unnerving lifeless density, becomes a permanent and standing reminder that something went terribly wrong in this place, in a way that time itself has not fully healed. Modern researchers have proposed various scientific explanations that attempt to bridge the gap between ancient texts and the physical terrain. A meteor airburst, similar to the Tunguska event of 1908, could potentially produce immense heat without leaving a visible crater. Such an explosion would generate powerful shock waves capable of flattening structures and igniting flammable materials over a vast area. It would also help explain the directional melting observed at some archaeological sites. Fire, in this scenario, would not fall vertically from the sky. It would arrive horizontally, expanding faster than the speed of sound. Other researchers point to the region's inherent tectonic instability. The Dead Sea Rift is one of the most active fault systems in the world. Earthquakes could potentially release pockets of highly flammable gases, creating sudden and devastating infernos. But earthquakes are a familiar phenomenon to ancient peoples. They leave behind survivors. They leave behind vivid stories of shaking ground and collapsing buildings. What is described in the older texts feels distinctly different, cleaner, more absolute, more final. There is also the crucial question of timing. Destruction layers at several archaeological sites across the southern Levant appear within a remarkably narrow window of time, not centuries apart, but closely clustered together. This pattern suggests a regional event rather than a series of isolated accidents. The land, for a brief and terrible moment, seems to have been treated as a single, unified surface exposed to a single, overwhelming force. If such a cataclysmic event occurred, its survivors would have faced an impossible task. How does one accurately describe a fire that does not behave like fire? How does one adequately warn future generations without inciting widespread panic or complete disbelief? Myth becomes a viable solution, not because it is inherently fanciful, but because it is intrinsically flexible. It allows the essential memory of the event to survive without demanding unwavering precision. Over time, the language inevitably shifts. Fire becomes the will of the gods. Heat becomes divine punishment. The terrifying randomness of catastrophe is softened by the reassuring idea of underlying order, even if that order is deeply terrifying. A city destroyed because it was inherently wicked is far easier to accept than a city destroyed simply because it stood in the wrong place at the wrong time. But beneath the moralizing surface, the older, more primal fear remains deeply embedded. It surfaces in small, seemingly insignificant details: the insistent command that no one look back, the sudden transformation of a human body into a pillar of salt, the overriding emphasis on immediacy. These are the undeniable fingerprints of profound shock, not the carefully constructed arguments of a religious sermon. Sumerian records, in stark contrast, do not moralize in the same way. They meticulously document cycles of the rise and fall of civilizations, the eras before and after, the concept of kingship lowered from heaven and then withdrawn. Civilization, in this view, is not a straight line of progress, but rather a series of fragile experiments. Fire is not punishment. It is simply erasure. And erasure does not argue its case. There is a subtle but fundamentally important difference here. In one tradition, catastrophe teaches a lesson. In the other, it simply interrupts. Teaching implies continuity, the possibility of learning and growth. Interruption implies a complete reset, a return to zero. If the Sumerian perspective preserves anything of lasting value, it is the profoundly unsettling idea that knowledge itself can be lost in an instant. That writing, cities, and even memory can vanish without a trace, leaving later cultures to painstakingly reconstruct meaning from scattered fragments. This reconstruction is never neutral or objective. Each generation inevitably shapes the past to fit its own prevailing anxieties and concerns. A people primarily concerned with law and covenant will remember fire as a just and deserved judgment. A people preoccupied with cosmic balance will remember it as a necessary correction. But the original event, whatever it truly was, remains just tantalizingly out of reach, like a distorted shape seen through thick smoke. As this layer of the story settles, the fundamental question quietly shifts. Not toward identifying who was guilty or which God acted, but toward a far more profound and unsettling inquiry. What kind of world allows such devastating events to occur at all? A world where the sky itself can suddenly become hostile? Where progress offers no reliable shield? Where the boundary between the ordinary and the utterly annihilating is far thinner than comfort allows? And if memory reshapes disaster to make it more bearable, what ultimately happens to the parts that simply cannot be reshaped? Do they sink into a deep and abiding silence, patiently waiting for a moment when the very ground itself begins to speak again? When catastrophe cannot be adequately explained, it is often carefully managed, not immediately, but gradually, as memory cools and survivors instinctively seek patterns that make endurance seem even remotely possible. In the ancient world, this management took many forms: elaborate ritual, formalized law, carefully constructed genealogy, and perhaps most subtly of all, silence deliberately arranged into a structured framework. In Mesopotamia, scribes were not merely record keepers. They were the custodians of continuity. Their essential work was to ensure that kings followed kings, that floods followed predictable warnings, that the gods remained legible and comprehensible to the human mind. Yet, in some sequences of tablets, continuity abruptly breaks down. Lists of rulers pause without explanation. Chronologies restart from seemingly arbitrary points. Entire generations seem to vanish between the carefully inscribed lines. These are not simply accidents of preservation. They suggest pivotal moments when order itself faltered and had to be painstakingly reassembled afterward. Such reassembly inevitably requires choices. What is carefully remembered? What is subtly softened or downplayed? What is deliberately and permanently erased, never to be written again? One pattern repeats itself with unsettling consistency. After explicit descriptions of overwhelming destruction, whether caused by catastrophic flood or unimaginable fire, the ancient texts often shift abruptly toward a renewed focus on reorganization. New laws appear, carefully defining new measures of land, new systems of weights and measures, and new calendars, as if the world, having been burned utterly clean, demanded a completely different framework to prevent recurrence, or at the very least, to offer the comforting illusion of control. In this light, the enduring story of Sodom and Gomorrah begins to resemble not simply a single moral episode, but rather the residual effect of a broader cultural reflex, a particular way of responding to trauma by deliberately narrowing its meaning, by carefully localizing it in both time and space. Two specific cities, not an entire region. A limited handful of specific transgressions, not an incomprehensible and all-consuming force. The story becomes smaller, safer, and therefore easier to pass down from generation to generation without inadvertently reopening the original, deeply traumatic wound. Yet the narrowing is never fully successful. The geography itself stubbornly resists it. The Dead Sea Basin remains an undeniable anomaly, geologically volatile, chemically hostile, and visually stark. It is a scar on the face of the earth that stubbornly refuses to fade with the passage of time. Travelers throughout history have consistently remarked on its unnatural stillness, its profound silence, and its apparent refusal to support life of any kind. These observations are often framed in terms of religious curiosity or divine punishment, but they also read like a deep-seated unease, a persistent sense that this place remembers something that most people have consciously chosen to forget. Ancient maps are particularly revealing in this context. Early cartographic traditions tend to deliberately distort or marginalize the region. It becomes a boundary, a liminal space, a place to be bypassed rather than actively entered. Even established trade routes subtly bend away, avoiding the area altogether. Avoidance, when consistently repeated over centuries, begins to resemble a form of memory encoded as behavior rather than explicit story. In Sumerian thought, places of particularly devastating destruction were sometimes marked as permanently closed, not formally forbidden in a legal sense, but conceptually sealed off, designated as areas where the normal, predictable relationship between humans and the divine had fundamentally broken down. To enter such a place without meticulous ritual preparation was considered inherently dangerous, not because of lingering vengeful gods, but because the fundamental balance of the world had not been fully restored. This idea of profound imbalance is absolutely crucial. Fire that erases entire cities does far more than simply destroy physical structures. It fundamentally disrupts trust in the reliability of the sky, trust in the predictable rhythm of the seasons, trust in the underlying assumption that tomorrow will resemble yesterday closely enough to allow for rational planning. When that fundamental trust breaks down so completely, societies become profoundly cautious, deeply conservative, and instinctively inclined to preserve the familiar rather than recklessly innovate. And yet, innovation inevitably returns. It always does. Cities rise again, sometimes directly on top of older, long-forgotten ruins. This layering is often described as resilience, but it may also be a form of cultural compulsion, a subconscious refusal to accept the unsettling truth that some places carry histories that are simply too volatile and dangerous to safely inhabit. Each act of rebuilding becomes an act of defiance against the weight of memory, or perhaps simply against the paralyzing grip of fear. In the biblical narrative, the survivors of Sodom and Gomorrah do not rebuild. They flee the area entirely, moving into the relative safety of the hills. The devastated cities are deliberately left empty. This seemingly minor detail is often overlooked, but it is profoundly significant. It suggests that the destruction was perceived as utterly final, not merely temporary. That whatever destructive force had acted there was not expected to simply remain dormant. Lot's wife, in this context, becomes less a simple moral figure and more a deeply psychological one. Turning back is not an act of willful disobedience. It is a fundamentally human reflex. The overwhelming desire to personally witness what has happened, to somehow confirm its awful reality, to anchor the surreal in the tangible certainty of sight. Her sudden transformation into a pillar of salt freezes that reflexive act mid-motion. Curiosity becomes fatal. Memory itself becomes intrinsically dangerous. Salt, again, is not simply incidental. Preserves, but it also sterilizes. A salted field cannot support crops. A salted body cannot decay normally. The powerful image suggests a kind of arrested aftermath. Nothing grows, nothing decays, nothing moves on. The moment of destruction remains suspended indefinitely in time. Some scholars have noted intriguing parallels between this vivid image and older Mesopotamian motifs where witnesses to divine catastrophe are sometimes deliberately altered, blinded, silenced, or transformed, not necessarily as a direct form of punishment, but rather as a form of containment. To see too much is to risk fundamentally destabilizing the present. If this is indeed the case, then the active management of memory is not only a cultural phenomenon, but also a deeply biological one. Trauma profoundly reshapes perception. It alters what can be freely spoken without causing further harm. Entire communities may unconsciously inherit these carefully constructed limits, passing them down through generations as deeply ingrained custom rather than explicit confession. This inheritance inevitably complicates modern attempts to reconstruct the past. Archaeology meticulously seeks patterns in the physical record. Textual analysis diligently seeks origins in ancient writings. But both disciplines inevitably encounter distinct zones of resistance, places where hard data thins out and interpretation becomes profoundly tentative. These challenging zones are often dismissed as mere gaps in the available evidence, but the gaps themselves carry crucial information. They tell us where the stories suddenly falter, where the earth stubbornly refuses to yield its secrets, and where the past remains, perhaps forever, just beyond our grasp. Certainty, however, proved elusive. In the Dead Sea region, these gaps in the historical record cluster together with unsettling frequency. It's not just a missing artifact here or a broken pottery shard there. It's a wholesale silence that descends. Occupation ceases. The steady hum of human activity abruptly cuts off. The written word, once confident and declarative, shifts its tone, becoming hesitant, questioning, even fearful. Myths, once fluid and adaptable, harden into rigid dogma, calcified narratives designed to ward off unseen threats. The land itself transforms, becoming a stark, unrelenting warning sign. Its message potent but maddeningly unclear. like a scream echoing across a desolate landscape. And so, in the generations that follow, traditions rise to fill the deafening silence, crafting meanings and explanations that conveniently align with their own evolving needs and desires. These narratives, however comforting, often leave a lingering sense of something unresolved, a loose thread that refuses to be neatly tucked away. If the destruction, whatever it was truly localized, contained within the immediate vicinity of the Dead Sea, why does its spectral echo reverberate so widely across the ancient world? Why do cultures separated by vast distances and differing languages stubbornly retain vivid, almost hallucinatory images of fire raining down from the heavens, of entire cities being erased from existence in a single catastrophic moment, of divine withdrawal followed by a painful, often brutal reordering of the world? Convergence, of course, does not definitively prove causation. Correlation is not necessarily causation, but the sheer ubiquity of these shared motifs across disparate cultures makes dismissing them as mere coincidence deeply unsettling. Perhaps the fiery cataclysm remembered in the ancient Sumerian clay tablets and the apocalyptic blaze recounted in the lore of the Levant were not, strictly speaking, the same singular event. Perhaps they were instead individual expressions of the same fundamental human vulnerability, the shared recognition that human settlements, for all their ambition and ingenuity, exist precariously beneath forces they cannot control, forces that possess the terrifying capacity to reset the world without so much as asking for permission. As this portion of the historical and archaeological journey settles into an unnerving quiet, the prevailing sense that emerges is not one of clarity or understanding, but of a deliberate containment, of stories carefully shaped and rigorously enforced to hold something far too large and terrifying to face directly. And if such meticulous containment was deemed necessary once, in the immediate aftermath of whatever cataclysmic event occurred, it inevitably raises a quieter, more insidious concern. What happens now, millennia later, when the very structures built to manage and contain those traumatic memories begin to erode and crumble under the relentless pressures of time? What happens when the old silences, so carefully maintained for so long, suddenly start to speak again? When silence persists for long enough, stretching across generations, it begins to subtly shape belief itself, not as codified doctrine or formally articulated creed, but as a primal, deeply ingrained instinct. Civilizations that inherit the unspoken weight of past catastrophes often develop heightened sensitivities that they themselves cannot fully explain or rationalize. Rituals that feel strangely excessive, taboos whose origins are lost to the mists of time, irrational fears that surface only at the edges of conscious language. These are not merely quaint superstitions or cultural eccentricities in the simple sense. They are, instead, a form of collective memory, adapted and refined over centuries for the fundamental purpose of survival. They are the inherited anxieties of a species grappling with the enduring legacy of a forgotten trauma. In the harsh, unforgiving land surrounding the Dead Sea, certain unsettling patterns recur with a quiet, almost unnerving insistence. Settlements gradually shift uphill, away from the vulnerable lowlands. Architecture becomes increasingly lighter, more temporary, as if the very notion of permanence has become suspect. Wells are dug with extreme caution, then sealed with meticulous care, as if the ground itself might exhale some unseen danger, some ancient poison that lies dormant beneath the cracked earth. These changes are rarely attributed to any single, identifiable cause in the surviving historical record. They appear instead as a series of incremental adjustments, each seemingly small and rational in isolation, but together painting a disturbing picture of an environment that is no longer fully trusted, no longer perceived as entirely safe. Fire, it seems, leaves behind more than just ash and scorched earth. It fundamentally alters the very landscape of the imagination, leaving an indelible mark on the collective psyche. A people who have witnessed the sky ignite, who have seen the heavens themselves turned into a raging inferno, do not look upward in quite the same way again. The heavens cease to be merely distant, remote, and indifferent. They become intimate, capable of sudden and terrifying intrusion, a constant reminder of the fragility of earthly existence. This newfound intimacy is, understandably, deeply unsettling. It demands explanation or, at the very least, some semblance of narrative control. Over generations, This need for control often manifests in the form of increasingly rigid laws and social codes. Rules governing hospitality, dictating permissible movement, and mandating absolute obedience during moments of perceived crisis become paramount. In the iconic story of Sodom, guests arrive unexpectedly at the city gates. They are to be protected at all costs, their safety paramount. The city, tragically, fails this fundamental test and is subsequently consumed by divine fire. For the casual reader, the immediate morality of the story is undeniably social. The importance of welcoming strangers, the dangers of inhospitality. But for those attuned to the deeper currents of collective memory, the lesson is far more procedural. When strangers arrive on the eve of catastrophe, they may not be strangers at all. They may be warnings, emissaries of impending doom. In many ancient societies, messengers and disasters were frequently and inextricably linked. A devastating flood is invariably preceded by a series of ominous signs. A deadly plague by disturbing dreams and visions. A cataclysmic fire by the arrival of mysterious visitors who must not, under any circumstances, be ignored. This recurring pattern does not necessarily imply the literal presence of angels or supernatural beings. It points instead to a heightened state of vigilance, an almost obsessive attention to anomalies, to subtle deviations from the established norm. When the world has betrayed you once, when it has demonstrated its capacity for sudden and unpredictable violence, you learn to watch for the slightest tremor, the faintest whisper of impending chaos. The insistence that Lot's family flee Sodom without delay, without gathering their possessions, without debate or retrospection, perfectly reflects this ingrained vigilance. Survival, in such a context, depends entirely on swift, decisive motion, not on rational understanding or intellectual contemplation. This is not the abstract logic of theology or philosophy. It is the hard-won, brutal logic of emergency, preserved and ritualized in myth and legend, passed down through generations as a crucial survival mechanism. Elsewhere in the ancient Near East, similar logics relentlessly reappear. Myths describe prosperous cities that were warned too late, their inhabitants lulled into complacency by a false sense of security. Kings who hesitate, paralyzed by doubt, and populations who stubbornly refuse to believe the warnings until the very moment of their utter erasure. These cautionary tales do not condemn doubt in abstract philosophical terms. They condemn the fatal consequences of delay, the catastrophic hesitation to act decisively when familiar patterns no longer align with expectations. Delay, in this context, is inherently dangerous because it implicitly assumes continuity. It assumes that tomorrow will, more or less, function in the same way as today. Catastrophic fire utterly shatters this assumption. It introduces the terrifying idea that the present can end suddenly, irrevocably, without warning or transition. This is an idea that is profoundly difficult to carry across the vast expanse of centuries. It threatens the very foundations of societal stability. So it inevitably becomes encoded indirectly in symbols and allegories rather than direct, explicit statements. Pillars of salt, burning rain, angels who refuse to explain themselves. These potent images compress raw, primal fear into manageable forms, allowing it to be safely passed on from one generation to the next without overwhelming the listener. Yet even compression has its limits. Over time, the original texture of the fear inevitably smooths out, its sharp edges softening into easily digestible allegory. The land may remain hostile, unforgiving, and barren, but the reason for its hostility gradually shifts from the physical to the moral. Sin replaces shock. Judgment replaces randomness. Meaning, however contrived, replaces the paralyzing grip of existential terror. This replacement is undoubtedly comforting, providing a sense of order and control in the face of chaos. But it is also fundamentally incomplete, because the ground itself, the silent witness to past events, still tells a very different story. Vast salt flats, stretching as far as the eye can see, do not concern themselves with morality. Melted stone, fused together in strange, unnatural formations, does not testify to ethics or divine retribution. It testifies instead to extreme temperature, to immense force, to prolonged duration, physical realities that stubbornly resist moral interpretation. When modern excavation peels back these carefully constructed layers of meaning and exposes the raw, unvarnished truth beneath, a profound sense of discomfort inevitably returns. Not because ancient texts are definitively disproven, but because they suddenly become far more complicated, far more unsettling. The comforting moral story may very well sit atop a stark physical reality, not necessarily in opposition to it, but as a desperate attempt to grapple with something that ultimately resisted all other forms of description. In this sense, the seemingly disparate biblical and Sumerian traditions may not be arguing with each other at all. They may be approaching the same gaping wound from entirely different angles, each attempting to make sense of the same incomprehensible trauma. One frames it as a catastrophic breach of divine order, the other as a sudden and inexplicable withdrawal of divine favor. But both, crucially, agree on one fundamental point. The world can change suddenly without warning, and when it does, all human frameworks, all carefully constructed systems of meaning, inevitably fracture and collapse. This devastating fracture may, in turn, help to explain another recurring motif in ancient mythology: the pervasive fear of looking back. To look back is to seek continuity, to desperately confirm that what was still is. But in a reset event, continuity is precisely what has been irrevocably broken. Looking back risks not just confusion and paralysis, but something far worse: a potentially fatal attachment to a world that no longer exists, a world that has been irrevocably erased. Psychologically, this makes perfect sense. Survivors of extreme traumatic events often report immense difficulty revisiting the moment of rupture, the point at which their lives were irrevocably shattered. Memory becomes disjointed, fragmented, unreliable. Sensory fragments intrude without context, overwhelming the senses. Language itself fails, proving woefully inadequate to capture the sheer horror of the experience. The mind, in its desperate attempt to protect itself, instinctively moves forward, sometimes at the terrible cost of coherence and understanding. If ancient societies experienced something analogous on a collective scale, it stands to reason that their myths and legends would reflect that same fundamental coping strategy. Move forward. Rebuild elsewhere. Rename the past as a cautionary lesson rather than a concrete historical event. Allow the painful details to blur and fade with time. And yet, the details persist stubbornly, refusing to be entirely erased. Fire that arrives without smoke or warning. Heat that kills instantly, vaporizing everything in its path. A region rendered uninhabitable for generations, poisoned by salt and ash. These are not easy details to allegorize completely. They resist full assimilation into any neat and tidy moral narrative. The Dead Sea itself becomes a kind of archive, a living testament to the enduring power of the past. Not a carefully curated library, but a vast, open-air reservoir of haunting reminders. Its unnaturally high density prevents drowning, forcing bodies to float unnaturally on its surface. Its briny shores preserve objects in salt, dramatically delaying the natural processes of decay. It is a place where the usual rhythms of erasure slow down, where traces of the past linger far longer than expected, stubbornly resisting the relentless march of time. Perhaps this is why the region continues to attract so much speculation, fascination, and outright obsession. Not because it promises easy answers or neat resolutions, but precisely because it refuses closure. Every attempt to fully explain it, to neatly categorize it, leaves behind a residue of unease, a lingering sense that something essential has been overlooked. Every story told about it casts a long, distorted shadow that does not quite align with the known landscape. As this particular part of the journey settles into an uneasy quiet, the dominant sense that emerges is that of a memory held in deliberate tension, neither fully forgotten nor fully understood, a fire remembered not as a tangible flame, but as a subtle but pervasive shift in behavior, as laws, taboos, and stories carefully shaped around a profound and unsettling absence. And if civilizations can, in fact, carry such profound absences within them, subtly shaping their fears and influencing their very structures in ways they no longer consciously recognize, it raises a quiet but unsettling possibility that some of what we proudly call culture is not, in fact, built on knowledge and understanding at all, but on a far more primal and instinctive impulse: avoidance. Avoidance, once deeply embedded within the fabric of society, inevitably begins to masquerade as tradition, cloaking itself in the comforting mantle of established custom. What initially began as a protective instinct, a desperate attempt to ward off unseen dangers, gradually hardens into rigid structure, then into unquestioned certainty. Over the course of centuries, people slowly forget what they were originally protecting themselves from, but they continue to meticulously perform the prescribed behaviors all the same, their original purpose long since lost to the mists of time. This, perhaps, is how civilizations inadvertently carry ghosts within them, haunting presences that subtly influence their every action, even as they remain unnamed and unacknowledged. In the ancient Near East, fire gradually becomes increasingly ceremonial as time passes, controlled, contained, and meticulously ritualized. Impressive altars replace open flames. Offerings are carefully measured, each element prescribed with painstaking precision. Fire is no longer permitted to roam freely across the landscape of the imagination, sparking creativity and inspiring both awe and terror. It must instead be summoned, supervised, and extinguished with the utmost care, lest it escape its carefully constructed boundaries. This shift is subtle, almost imperceptible, but profoundly telling. A force once feared for its sheer autonomy, for its capacity to unleash chaos and destruction, is now carefully framed as something that obeys strict rules, something that can be reliably controlled through ritual and incantation. Yet beneath this veneer of order and control, a palpable sense of anxiety relentlessly lingers. Many ritual texts from the period include elaborate and often baffling precautions, stringent purification steps, precise timings dictated by the movements of the celestial bodies, and absolute prohibitions against even the slightest error. A mistake is not merely incorrect or inefficient. It is inherently dangerous, capable of unleashing forces that are far beyond human comprehension. Fire, if mishandled or disrespected, does not forgive. It does not forget. The language surrounding it carries a palpable tension, as though the writers are acutely aware that what they are meticulously controlling is only a smaller, safer, heavily diluted echo of something once far more vast and uncontrollable. This underlying tension subtly reappears in countless stories of divine presence and intervention. When gods descend from the heavens, they invariably do so shrouded in fire, cloaked in impenetrable clouds, or radiating blinding light. Their arrival is inevitably overwhelming, disorienting, leaving mortals humbled and trembling in their wake. Humans are routinely instructed to keep their distance, to remain within carefully prescribed boundaries. The encounter is possible, even desirable, but it is always strictly limited. To approach too closely, to violate the established protocols, is to risk utter annihilation. Such stories are often conventionally read as expressions of profound reverence and awe, highlighting the vast gulf that separates humanity from the divine. But they may also be read as subtle manifestations of inherited caution, as encoded memories of a time when proximity went terribly wrong, of a catastrophic moment when the carefully maintained boundary between human settlement and cosmic force collapsed with irreversible and devastating consequences. The Sumerian concept of divine withdrawal after moments of catastrophe is especially revealing in this regard. In some texts, the gods are said to retreat following acts of widespread destruction, leaving humanity to fend for itself and rebuild alone amidst the ruins. This withdrawal is not typically framed as divine abandonment or capricious punishment, but rather as a grim necessity. The sheer presence of such immense power, it seems, is simply too destabilizing, too disruptive to remain in close proximity to humanity indefinitely. This mirrors a common psychological pattern observed in the aftermath of severe trauma. Survivors often describe a pervasive sense of distance and detachment from others, from previously held beliefs and values, and indeed, from the world as it once was. The withdrawal is rarely consciously chosen or deliberately enacted. It happens almost automatically, a protective mechanism designed to shield the individual from further emotional or psychological harm. Closeness simply feels too unsafe, too intense, too unpredictable. If early civilizations experienced a cataclysmic event characterized by overwhelming heat and destruction, it is not unreasonable to suggest that their myths of distant and often indifferent gods may subtly reflect this fundamental shift in perspective. a move away from direct intimacy to regulated separation, from shared space to carefully controlled contact. Heaven, in essence, moves farther away, not because humans have somehow fallen from grace, but because proximity has simply proven to be too lethal, too dangerous to sustain. Over time, this carefully enforced distance gradually becomes normalized, codified into the very fabric of culture. Gods belong in the sky, in the realm of the abstract and unknowable. Humans, conversely, remain firmly below, confined to the earthly plane. The radical idea that the sky itself could violently intervene in human affairs, raining down fire and brimstone without warning, becomes increasingly unthinkable, gradually relegated to the realm of symbolism and metaphor. Fire from above is subtly transformed into a rhetorical device, a tool for prophecy or a distant end-time speculation. Something that either happened a long time ago or will potentially happen sometime in the far-off future, but certainly not now, not in the reassuringly predictable present. This temporal displacement is critically important. It effectively pushes the threat of sudden catastrophe out of the immediate present, allowing daily life to proceed with some semblance of normalcy. The fiery cataclysm becomes safely relegated to the past or the distant future, never immediate, never imminent. In doing so, societies can protect themselves from the debilitating effects of constant vigilance, which would otherwise paralyze all purposeful action and condemn them to a state of perpetual fear. But this displacement also comes at a significant cost. It inevitably dulls sensitivity to potential warning signs, creating a false sense of security. When danger is always lurking elsewhere in time, the present begins to feel deceptively stable, predictable, and benign. The sky, once a source of both awe and terror, gradually becomes mere scenery, a passive backdrop to human affairs. Weather, once meticulously observed and carefully interpreted, becomes mere background noise. Anomalies, subtle deviations from the established norm, are increasingly dismissed, rationalized, or simply ignored. Archaeological layers, however, tell a very different story. They show undeniable cycles of confidence and interruption, periods of dense settlement and robust economic activity followed by sudden, often inexplicable emptiness. Not all of these interruptions are necessarily violent, but some are unmistakably abrupt, leaving behind unmistakable traces of widespread destruction and societal collapse. The overall rhythm suggests not a single, isolated, and long-forgotten catastrophe, but a recurring pattern of forgetting itself, a collective amnesia that subtly undermines the very foundations of civilization. Each successive generation inherits the carefully constructed structures built by the previous one: walls, laws, myths, and meticulously codified social customs. These structures implicitly assume continuity, a predictable and relatively stable environment. They are designed for a world that behaves according to established rules and patterns. When the world stubbornly refuses to behave, when it defies expectations and unleashes chaos, these carefully constructed structures fail quickly and often completely. In the iconic case of Sodom and Gomorrah, this structural failure is meticulously preserved as a cautionary spectacle, a chilling warning to future generations. Fire rains down from the heavens, reducing thriving cities to smoldering ruins. The few survivors escape with nothing, their lives irrevocably shattered. The story is stark and unforgettable precisely because it compresses the complex, multifaceted nature of societal collapse into a single, devastating image. But collapse itself is rarely so clean, so instantaneous, so dramatically contained. It typically unfolds across multiple systems and scales, subtly eroding the foundations of food security, economic stability, social trust, and ultimately collective meaning. The biblical account undoubtedly simplifies this complex and protracted process, perhaps intentionally. By attributing the destruction of Sodom and Gomorrah to a clear and identifiable moral cause, the biblical narrative effectively restores a comforting sense of order to an otherwise chaotic and unpredictable world. Behavior predictably leads to outcome. Obedience inevitably leads to survival. Disobedience, conversely, inevitably leads to swift and devastating death. This clarity is undeniably soothing, providing a sense of control and understanding in the face of overwhelming uncertainty, especially when the only conceivable alternative is the terrifying prospect of utter randomness. Yet the Sumerian echoes, fragmented and ambiguous as they are, stubbornly resist this comforting clarity. They speak of destruction without explicit instruction, of profound loss without any discernible lesson, of eras ending simply because they end, their demise seemingly devoid of any deeper meaning or purpose. This perspective is undeniably more unsettling, forcing us to confront the inherent fragility and precariousness of human existence. But it is also arguably more honest to the lived experience of catastrophic events. When these two seemingly disparate traditions intersect, friction inevitably emerges. Moral certainty rubs abrasively against existential unease, creating a palpable tension that resonates across the centuries. The result is a complex and multifaceted story that oscillates between confident moral judgment and a lingering sense of unease, haunted by the vivid and unforgettable details of the catastrophe itself. The sheer speed of the fire, the utter totality of the loss. Modern readers often instinctively side with one interpretation or the other, polarizing the narrative into mutually exclusive categories. Either the story is purely symbolic, a moral allegory designed to impart ethical lessons, or it is primarily historical, a factual account of a real event. Either the destruction was divinely ordained punishment for human sin, or it was a purely physical phenomenon, driven by geological or meteorological forces. But the ancient mind did not divide the world in such rigid and artificial ways. Meaning and matter were inextricably intertwined, each influencing and shaping the other. A fire that destroys entire cities also inevitably destroys assumptions, forcing a painful reevaluation on every level, from the individual to the societal. Perhaps this is precisely why the story of Sodom and Gomorrah continues to resonate so powerfully across the millennia. Not because it offers easy answers or comfortable certainties, but because it subtly preserves the essential tension between the moral and the physical, the divine and the human, the known and the unknown. A persistent sense that beneath our carefully constructed explanations, something profound and unsettling stubbornly remains unresolved. As civilizations advanced, they undoubtedly became better at recording information, categorizing phenomena, and predicting future events. But no system, however sophisticated, can ever fully eliminate human vulnerability. The sky remains vast and unpredictable. The earth remains geologically active, prone to sudden and violent shifts. Heat remains an indifferent force, capable of both creation and destruction. The deeper question, then, is not whether Sodom and Gomorrah existed exactly as described in the biblical narrative, or whether the ancient Sumerian tablets refer to precisely the same event. The deeper and far more significant question is how much of human culture, in all its complexity and diversity, is ultimately shaped by encounters with forces that exceed our limited comprehension, and how much of what we so readily call morality is, in reality, a desperate attempt to negotiate with those same forces after the fact, to impose some semblance of order on a fundamentally chaotic universe. As this particular part of the journey settles into an unsettling quiet, what lingers most vividly is the image of fire, no longer visible in its immediate and terrifying form, but still subtly shaping human behavior across the centuries. A past event transformed into pervasive feelings of distance, elaborate rituals, and deeply ingrained restraint. And if avoidance, that most primal of human instincts, can indeed become tradition, then tradition itself may sometimes be understood as a subtly encoded map of dangers we no longer even remember how to name, a silent guide to navigating a world haunted by forgotten traumas. Tradition, once firmly established, inevitably begins to speak with the seemingly unassailable voice of inevitability, its origins obscured by the relentless passage of time. What began as a conscious response to a specific threat gradually hardens into a rigid rule, an unquestioned social norm. What was once a vivid and emotionally charged memory slowly transforms into a sacred mandate, a moral imperative that brooks no argument. In that subtle but inexorable transformation, the originating event retreats further and further into the shadows of the past, leaving behind elaborate structures that feel ancient, authoritative, and strangely detached from their original source. After periods of overwhelming disruption and widespread destruction, societies inevitably tend to reorganize themselves around the seemingly reassuring concept of permanence. Materials change. Durable stone slowly replaces vulnerable mud brick. Laws multiply, becoming increasingly complex and meticulously codified. Genealogies lengthen, providing a sense of continuity and stability. The future is diligently protected, not through adaptability and innovation, but through the comforting power of repetition, through the unwavering adherence to established patterns. This instinct is, perhaps, understandable. When the world has brutally demonstrated its capacity for sudden and catastrophic erasure, stability inevitably becomes sacred, a bulwark against the ever-present threat of chaos. Yet permanence, as the ancient philosophers and poets have repeatedly reminded us, is ultimately a fragile illusion. Stone endures, it is true, but it also subtly conceals underlying weaknesses, lulling people into a false sense of security. The higher the walls, the more confidence is placed in their protective power, and the greater the confidence, the more likely it is that neglect will quietly set in, eroding the very foundations of the structure from within. In the haunting memory of Sodom and Gomorrah, however, permanence is conspicuously and unsettlingly absent. The cities vanish entirely, consumed by fire and brimstone. No rebuilding follows. No comforting promise of eventual restoration ever appears later in the narrative. This utter finality is highly unusual. In most ancient accounts of destruction and renewal, cities fall, then inevitably rise again, often under new names and with new inhabitants, but always carrying forward the torch of civilization. Here, however, absence itself becomes the monument, a stark and enduring reminder of the fragility of human existence. That absence, stark and uncompromising, may well serve a critical purpose. A city rebuilt too quickly allows for forgetting, a dangerous complacency that invites future disaster. An empty plain, however, forces remembrance, even if that remembrance is inevitably uneasy, incomplete, and fraught with uncertainty. Over time, the land itself becomes the archive, a silent repository of collective memory. Those who pass through the Dead Sea Basin, even today, often describe a range of unsettling sensations that are difficult to articulate in precise, scientific terms. The air inexplicably feels heavier, thicker, more oppressive. Sound behaves oddly, echoing and distorting in strange and unpredictable ways. Distances seem subtly compressed, challenging the familiar rules of perspective. These subjective impressions are undeniably difficult to quantify and verify. Yet they remain remarkably consistent across eras and across vastly different cultural backgrounds. They suggest an environment that stubbornly resists familiarity, that persistently refuses to become mere background scenery. Ancient people, living in a world without sophisticated scientific instruments, relied heavily on such embodied perceptions, trusting their senses to guide them through a potentially dangerous landscape. Before the advent of precise measuring tools, the body itself was the primary measuring device, responding instinctively to subtle shifts in the environment. Discomfort, in this context, carried profound meaning, serving as a critical warning sign. A place that simply felt wrong, that triggered a primal sense of unease, was treated with extreme caution, either rigorously avoided or surrounded by elaborate rituals designed to appease unseen forces. This was not irrational superstition, but embodied knowledge, a form of collective intelligence meticulously shaped by the relentless pressures of survival. In this light, the designation of certain lands as cursed or forbidden may reflect accumulated experiential knowledge rather than purely theological invention. A region where crops consistently fail, where the water sickens and kills, and where human settlement simply refuses to take root would quickly earn a reputation for being somehow tainted, cursed, or intrinsically dangerous. Over generations, that reputation would inevitably solidify into compelling stories, cautionary tales designed to transmit vital knowledge across time. The story, in turn, accomplishes what individual experience alone cannot. It effectively transmits caution across the vast expanse of time, warning future generations of potential threats. In the ancient Sumerian texts, lands affected by catastrophic events are sometimes described as silent, devoid of the sounds of human activity. Silence here is not the silence of peace and tranquility. It is, rather, the unsettling absence of human rhythm, the eerie lack of familiar sounds. No bustling markets, no joyful songs, no comforting domestic noise. Silence as an unintended outcome rather than a deliberate intention. These lands are not inherently evil or inherently cursed. They are simply incompatible with ordinary human life, their resources depleted, their environments irrevocably altered. Later traditions, however, often reinterpret this incompatibility as a form of divine punishment, imposing a moral framework on a purely physical reality. The logic is undeniably comforting. A punished land conveniently explains why it should be avoided, providing a seemingly rational justification for staying away. A damaged land demands explanation, satisfying the inherent human need for meaning and order. Avoidance in such a context is not merely a matter of practical survival. It is a morally justifiable act, a way of respecting the divine will. But explanation, however comforting, also inevitably invites risk. Curiosity is a powerful and often irresistible force, and the desire to understand the causes of past disasters can easily override the inherent risks involved in venturing into forbidden territory. Avoidance preserves life. Explanation, conversely, invites potential danger. This tension between the need to avoid dangerous places and the irresistible urge to explore them relentlessly recurs throughout human history. Volcanoes, active fault lines, and the impact sites of ancient meteor strikes all draw observers who feel compelled to look closer, to unravel the mysteries of the past, even when the potential for danger is clearly evident. The same compelling impulse may well have operated around the ruined sites associated with Sodom and Gomorrah, drawing people back to the scene of the disaster despite the inherent risks. The land relentlessly warned people away, broadcasting its danger in subtle but unmistakable ways. But human imagination, fueled by a potent mixture of curiosity and anxiety, kept pulling them back, beckoning them to confront the mysteries of the past. Imagination, however, inevitably reshapes what it touches, subtly altering the very nature of reality. Over time, raw curiosity becomes abstract contemplation, as people attempt to make sense of the incomprehensible. Physical details blur, becoming less distinct and less relevant. Moral frameworks, conversely, sharpen, becoming increasingly rigid and dogmatic. The ruined cities slowly transform into abstract symbols rather than concrete locations, their physical reality fading into the mists of time. Their destruction becomes a timeless allegory rather than a situated historical event. This abstraction, while understandable, allows the story to travel more easily, transcending geographical and cultural boundaries. It becomes portable, adaptable to new anxieties and contemporary concerns. Fire from the sky transforms into a readily accessible rhetorical instrument, invoked whenever societies feel threatened by excess, disorder, or perceived moral decline. The catastrophic event, once a vivid and visceral memory, subtly transforms into a potent idea, a malleable concept that can be endlessly reinterpreted and reapplied to new and evolving circumstances. But this enhanced portability comes at a significant cost. It inevitably strips the original event of its specificity, severing the critical connection between narrative and environment. The destruction feels less real, less tangible, and therefore easier to dismiss as mere allegory, a convenient fiction designed to reinforce existing power structures. The Earth, however, stubbornly resists this dismissal. Salt formations relentlessly remain, silently testifying to the enduring power of the past. Ash layers persist, providing irrefutable evidence of ancient conflagrations. Melted stone records temperature, not morality, bearing silent witness to the immense power of heat. These materials testify not to ethics or divine judgment, but to force and duration, to the fundamental laws of physics that govern the universe. Modern inquiry approaches such evidence cautiously, recognizing the inherent challenges in interpreting ancient events. Claims of ancient high-energy events, particularly those that challenge conventional geological or historical assumptions, often provoke resistance from established experts. They challenge long-held assumptions about gradual change, predictable risk, and the inherently stable nature of the world around us. To accept them is to accept that history includes moments of radical discontinuity, periods of abrupt and often inexplicable change that defy easy categorization. Discontinuity inevitably unsettles comforting narratives of linear progress, exposing the inherent fragility of human advancement. It suggests that knowledge can vanish, that technology can be lost, and that even the most complex and sophisticated societies are ultimately vulnerable to forces beyond their control. Ancient cultures, steeped in myth and legend, may have understood this fundamental truth more intuitively than we do. Their myths allow for resets, acknowledging the cyclical nature of history. They assume cycles of rise and fall, of creation and destruction. Civilization is not guaranteed. It is provisional, contingent upon factors that are often beyond human control. In the ancient Sumerian king lists, for example, rulership is said to descend from heaven and later be withdrawn, suggesting a conditional authority that exists only at the discretion of forces far beyond human comprehension. Cities flourish only while permission holds, and when that permission is revoked, even the most powerful empires can crumble into dust. Fire that erases entire cities fits easily into this worldview, seamlessly integrating into a broader understanding of the cyclical nature of existence. It is not a random aberration or an inexplicable anomaly, but a form of enforcement, a stark and terrifying reminder that human achievements, however impressive, are ultimately temporary and contingent. Systems operate beneath constraints they cannot negotiate with. The natural world, governed by immutable laws and physical realities, functions according to principles far beyond the reach of human bargaining or appeal. These are the cold, hard parameters within which all life, including human society, must exist. The biblical tradition, in contrast, emphasizes covenant. It posits a relationship, a sacred pact promising continuity and prosperity, but only if specific conditions of obedience and righteousness are meticulously met. This is a conditional agreement, a contract with the divine, offering hope but demanding unwavering adherence. Sodom and Gomorrah appear as exceptions, glaring examples of covenant broken. These cities, steeped in alleged wickedness, stand as stark reminders of the consequences of violating the divine contract. Yet, even here, the narrative hesitates, revealing a fascinating tension. Negotiation occurs. Abraham, pleading for mercy, engages in a desperate bargaining session with God, haggling over numbers, seeking to spare the innocent. Mercy is considered. The annihilation is not immediate. There is a delay, a pause for consideration. This delay suggests discomfort, as though the tradition itself struggles to reconcile total erasure with moral order. The swift, absolute destruction jars against the underlying principles of justice and divine patience. That struggle may preserve an older memory beneath the moral frame, a memory of fire that did not wait for judgment, negotiation, or explanation, a fire that arrived because conditions aligned, not because sins were tallied, a celestial event perhaps indifferent to human morality. As this part of the journey settles, attention shifts from what was destroyed to what endured. What lingering echoes of the catastrophe remain? What shadows does it cast on the collective psyche? Habits, fears, avoidances, structures built around an absence. These are the subtle, often unconscious, legacies of trauma. Civilizations often define themselves by what they remember, weaving narratives of heroism and triumph. But survival may depend just as much on what they choose to forget carefully, deliberately, and never completely. This act of selective amnesia is a crucial defense mechanism, shielding against the overwhelming weight of the past. And if forgetting can function as protection, then remembering when it resurfaces may carry a danger of its own. The past, if unearthed too carelessly, can shatter the fragile equilibrium of the present. When a memory threatens stability, it rarely disappears. Instead, it changes shape. It sinks below language and resurfaces as habit, as rhythm, as an unspoken sense of caution that no one remembers learning. This is the deep, visceral knowledge encoded in the very fabric of culture. This is how civilizations carry knowledge they cannot afford to confront directly. Taboos, superstitions, and unwritten rules are often the disguised remnants of past traumas. In many ancient cultures, danger was not always named. It was scheduled. Certain seasons were treated differently. Certain nights were observed in silence. Fires were lit or extinguished according to patterns that seemed arbitrary to later observers, but felt necessary to those who inherited them. These patterns did not explain themselves. They did not need to. They worked. Calendars, in this sense, were not neutral tools. They were memory devices. They encoded anxiety into time, a reminder that the world was not uniformly safe, that some moments carried greater risk than others. The solstices and equinoxes were not merely astronomical markers. They were potential thresholds for chaos. This was especially true in societies that watched the sky closely, not for beauty, but for deviation. Long before formal astronomy, people learned to recognize regularity. Stars that returned, seasons that cycled, the predictable rhythm of celestial events. Against this backdrop of predictability, anything that broke pattern became significant. Sudden lights, trails across the darkness, a night brighter than it should be. These events were rare, but their rarity made them memorable. In Mesopotamian omen texts, celestial irregularities are catalogued with painstaking care. The language is cautious, observational. It avoids certainty. A star flares unexpectedly, and the tablet notes what followed. Unrest, famine, destruction. The relationship is not always causal, but it is never ignored. Fire from the sky occupies a unique position in this system. It is not continuous like rain. It is not cyclical like flood. It is episodic, sudden, transformative. Its arrival collapses time, turning anticipation into aftermath in a single moment. If such an event once devastated a populated region, it would have left more than physical scars. It would have recalibrated attention. The sky would no longer be background. It would become an actor capable of intervention, a source of both wonder and terror. This recalibration may explain why some traditions preserve a heightened alertness to signs while others move quickly to moral interpretation. Watching the sky requires patience and uncertainty. Moral framing offers clarity. One demands vigilance, the other demands obedience. The biblical account of Sodom and Gomorrah leans toward obedience. The warning is specific, delivered privately. There is no public sign, no chance for collective response. The destruction is framed as sudden and total, emphasizing the futility of resistance once the moment arrives. Yet the suddenness itself feels observational rather than symbolic. The cities are destroyed before anyone can react. There is no siege, no gradual escalation. Night becomes unbearable brightness. Heat precedes sound. These details feel less like allegory and more like memory compressed into narrative. In later centuries, eyewitness accounts of meteor air bursts describe similar sequences. A flash brighter than the sun, a wave of heat that ignites surfaces, confusion so intense that people cannot tell which direction is safe. The body reacts before the mind understands. If ancient witnesses experience something comparable, their descendants would inherit the aftermath without the event itself. Ruined land, abandoned settlements, stories too frightening to repeat in full. Over time, the event would recede, leaving only its behavioral consequences. One such consequence is dispersion. After catastrophic loss, populations tend to spread out. Large, dense cities feel dangerous. Smaller communities feel safer. This pattern appears repeatedly after major disruptions. It is not ideological. It is instinctive. In the Levant, periods following destruction layers often show reduced urban density. Settlements fragment. Trade routes shift. It is as though people unconsciously recalibrate risk, even if they cannot articulate why. Over generations, this recalibration becomes normal. Cities grow again. Confidence returns. The sky fades back into scenery, but the old patterns remain embedded, dormant, ready to resurface when conditions align. This dormancy is important. It allows societies to function without constant fear. Yet, it also creates vulnerability. When memory is buried too deeply, warning signs may go unrecognized. What was once known as dangerous becomes merely unusual. The Sumerian worldview seems to accept this cycle. Knowledge is lost, relearned, lost again. Civilization is an oscillation, not a trajectory. Fire, flood, and famine are not failures of morality, but expressions of scale. Humanity operates within a system that does not center human intention. The biblical worldview pushes against this acceptance. It insists that meaning governs outcome, that behavior matters, that catastrophe communicates something. This insistence preserves agency, but it also narrows interpretation. Perhaps both approaches are incomplete on their own. Observation without meaning breeds anxiety. Meaning without observation breeds complacency. The ancient texts preserve fragments of both even when they appear to contradict each other. In the story of Sodom and Gomorrah, the sky is strangely silent. No stars are mentioned, no signs recorded. Yet the destruction feels cosmological in scale. This silence may itself be a clue, a sign that the original observational context was already fading when the story was written down. What remained was urgency, fear, and the sense that once the moment arrives, explanation is irrelevant. Survival depends on motion, not comprehension. This emphasis on immediacy may be the most faithful inheritance of the original event. Whatever caused the fire, it did not allow deliberation. It did not announce itself publicly. It arrived, transformed the landscape, and withdrew, leaving humans to argue over meaning afterward. As modern societies accumulate data and predictive tools, it is tempting to believe that such moments belong to the past, that we would see them coming, that nothing so sudden could surprise us now. And yet, uncertainty persists. Objects go undetected. Systems fail. Rare events remain rare precisely because they defy expectation. Ancient stories endure not because they explain the world, but because they remind us of its capacity to exceed explanation. They whisper that beneath our structures, calendars, and assurances, there remains an element of exposure. As this part of the journey settles into quiet, the sense that lingers is not fear, but attentiveness, a subtle shift of awareness upward and outward toward the recognition that some knowledge survives best when it does not speak loudly. And if memory has learned to disguise itself to endure, then perhaps the most important truths are not those declared openly, but those that continue to shape behavior long after their origin has been forgotten. As memory disguises itself, it does not vanish. It migrates. It moves from observation into structure, from structure into instinct, from instinct into silence. Over long spans of time, this migration reshapes not only stories but landscapes of belief. What remains visible is rarely the origin. What remains powerful is the pressure it exerts. In the centuries after great destruction, societies often develop a deep attachment to boundaries. Not only walls and borders, but conceptual limits between sacred and profane, safe and unsafe, permitted and forbidden. These limits are not arbitrary. They are defensive geometry drawn to keep chaos from leaking back in. In the region associated with Sodom and Gomorrah, boundaries multiply. The land becomes segmented. Usable ground here, dead ground there. Water drinkable in one place, poisonous in another. The terrain itself teaches discrimination. Step too far, dig too deep, linger too long, and the environment responds harshly. Ancient people did not require theory to understand this. They learned through repetition, through loss, through the quiet transmission of caution from one generation to the next. This is how certain regions acquire reputations that outlive explanation. Over time, these reputations become symbolic. A valley stands not just for a place, but for a category of danger, a reminder embedded in geography. When stories speak of destruction by fire, listeners do not imagine any city. They imagine that place. The land itself becomes a mnemonic device. Yet mnemonics fade when removed from context. As populations shift, as languages change, as empires rise and fall, the original environmental knowledge weakens. What was once practical caution becomes moral metaphor. The land remains, but its meaning transforms. This transformation can be seen in how later texts handle detail. Early accounts are sparse, hesitant, almost reluctant. Later retellings grow more confident, more polished. The roughness of lived experience smooths into narrative clarity. Ambiguity resolves into lesson. But clarity is not the same as accuracy. It is simply easier to transmit. The biblical tradition shaped by centuries of reinterpretation preserves the destruction of Sodom and Gomorrah as a moment of absolute judgment. The emphasis is on transgression, on violation of order. The fire becomes a response. The cause is named even if the mechanism remains vague. What recedes is the environmental specificity, the land's volatility, the region's instability, the possibility that the cities were not uniquely wicked but uniquely vulnerable, that they stood at the intersection of forces indifferent to moral distinction. This receding does not negate the story's power. It redirects it. The story becomes ethical rather than geological, portable rather than situated. Can be told anywhere, applied everywhere. Yet something is lost in this portability. The sense that catastrophe has geography, that not all places are equal, that some locations carry risks invisible until activated. Modern disaster studies return in a way to this older sensitivity. They map fault lines, floodplains, impact probabilities. They recognize that where something happens matters as much as what happens. But this recognition is recent, and it exists alongside centuries of abstraction. Ancient cultures may have held both understandings simultaneously. They lacked instruments, but they possessed attentiveness. They may not have known why certain places failed repeatedly, but they noticed that they did. In Sumerian thought, the land itself could become angry or closed, not emotionally but functionally, a place no longer receptive to human order. Attempts to impose structure there would collapse. Crops would fail. Buildings would not last. This idea appears again and again in myths of cursed ground, barren valleys, forbidden zones. Such places are rarely redeemed. They're avoided, respected, sometimes ritualized, but rarely reclaimed. The biblical narrative reflects this avoidance. After the destruction, the plain is left behind. Life moves upward away from the valley. The geography of survival shifts. Higher ground feels safer, even if it is less fertile. Security replaces abundance as the priority. This shift echoes patterns seen after many large-scale disasters. People trade efficiency for safety, density for dispersion. The instinct is not ideological. It is embodied memory responding to threat. Over generations, as threat perception fades, density returns. Cities grow again. The old instincts loosen. Boundaries soften. Confidence rebuilds. And with it, vulnerability quietly re-enters. The story of Sodom and Gomorrah may persist because it interrupts this cycle. It reintroduces rupture into continuity. It insists that erasure is possible, that not all decline is gradual, that some endings arrive without negotiation. This insistence is uncomfortable. It resists assimilation into progress narratives. It suggests that human systems, no matter how refined, remain contingent. In the Sumerian worldview, contingency is assumed. The gods are not bound to human schedules. Favor is granted, then withdrawn. Errors end, new ones begin. There is no promise that the next age will resemble the last. The biblical worldview struggles with this impermanence. It seeks covenant, continuity, assurance. When catastrophe breaks through, it must be explained in moral terms to preserve coherence. Both approaches serve a purpose. One prepares for disruption. The other preserves meaning. Between them lies tension that has never fully resolved. Perhaps that tension is itself the inheritance of an event too large to be contained by a single interpretation. A fire that altered land behavior and belief simultaneously. As this part of the journey settles, attention drifts back to the ground, to salt-crusted soil, to abandoned spaces, to places where nothing grows, not because nothing has been planted, but because conditions refuse cooperation. Such places remind us that history is not only written by people. It is also written by environments, by heat, by shock, by forces that leave marks long after stories have changed. And if landscapes can remember what cultures reshape, then the earth itself may be holding a version of the past that no narrative can fully translate, waiting patiently, indifferent to whether it is believed. When the land refuses to cooperate, interpretation begins to fracture. People search for reasons that fit their frameworks, even when the ground itself offers none. Over time, explanation replaces observation, and the landscape becomes a canvas for meaning rather than evidence. Yet the evidence remains quietly resisting translation. In the centuries following great destruction, societies often turn inward. Attention shifts from environment to behavior, from external forces to internal order. Laws grow more detailed. Codes become stricter. The assumption takes hold that if life can be controlled precisely enough, catastrophe can be kept at bay. This shift is understandable. Forces that cannot be negotiated with are terrifying. Rules, by contrast, feel manageable. They imply causality. They promise that outcomes can be shaped through compliance. In this way, law becomes a kind of shelter against randomness. The story of Sodom and Gomorrah sits at the center of this transformation. Its later interpretations emphasize social violation, excess, and refusal of hospitality. The cities are destroyed not because of where they stand, but because of how their people behave. The fire becomes a response, not an intrusion. Yet the ground beneath the story does not confirm this neatness. Environmental collapse does not follow moral logic. Salt does not accumulate selectively. Heat does not discriminate between virtuous and corrupt stone. The physical aftermath described barren land, poisoned water. Lasting abandonment suggests a force indifferent to human categories. This indifference may explain why earlier layers of the tradition feel uneasy. The narrative rushes past the event. It avoids sensory detail. It does not linger on suffering. The destruction is asserted, not described, as if description itself might destabilize the moral frame. Elsewhere in the ancient world, similar patterns appear. Catastrophes are acknowledged, then quickly reinterpreted. Floods become cleansing. Fires become judgment. Earthquakes become omens. Each interpretation restores a sense of intelligibility even when it distorts causation. The Sumerian approach differs subtly. It accepts loss without fully justifying it. Cities fall because eras end. Kingship withdraws. Balance resets. There is no insistence that destruction proves guilt. Proves vulnerability. This acceptance does not comfort. It exposes. It leaves humanity exposed to scale, to repetition, to the possibility that effort and virtue are not always sufficient. For many cultures, this exposure is intolerable. Meaning must intervene. As Hebrew tradition develops, meaning takes the form of covenant, a structured relationship between the human and the divine that promises continuity under conditions. Catastrophe, when it occurs, must therefore signal breach. Otherwise, the covenant loses coherence. Sodom and Gomorrah become examples, outliers that reinforce the rule. Their destruction proves that order exists, even if it is harsh. Fire becomes intelligible, framed by narrative necessity. But the price of intelligibility is compression. Complexity is flattened. Environmental specificity dissolves. The region becomes emblematic rather than particular. The catastrophe becomes timeless rather than historical. This flattening has consequences. When later readers encounter the story, they are invited to judge behavior, not to question setting. The land itself fades into background. Its volatility becomes incidental. Modern archaeology disrupts this comfort. It insists on place, on stratigraphy, on material cause. It returns attention to where and how rather than why in moral terms. In doing so, it reopens questions that narrative had sealed. This reopening is unsettling. It suggests that some disasters attributed to moral failure may have originated in natural processes amplified by location and timing, that cities were not punished so much as positioned poorly. Position is a difficult explanation to accept. It implies that survival may depend less on righteousness than on geography, less on intention than on circumstance. Ancient people may have understood this more clearly than their texts reveal. They avoided certain lands. They respected boundaries. They encoded caution into movement and settlement patterns. These behaviors speak of environmental awareness that does not always surface in story. The biblical narrative preserves a trace of this awareness in the command to flee without delay. There is no attempt to negotiate with the land, no effort to appease it. Survival requires departure, not correction. Once the departure occurs, the story closes the door. The cities are not revisited. Their fate is sealed. Memory moves on, but the land does not. It remains altered, resistant, quietly recording what occurred. It waits for those willing to listen to stone rather than story. In this sense, geology becomes a rival archive, one that does not moralize, one that does not adapt for transmission. It records pressure, temperature, duration, tells time differently. When these two archives, textual and material records, when juxtaposed, create a palpable tension. It's not a direct contradiction, but rather a divergence in emphasis. One is driven by the quest for meaning, a narrative thread woven through experience. The other meticulously preserves the process itself, the raw, unfiltered data of existence. The central question then becomes, which archive does society prioritize, and under what circumstances? For centuries, the power of storytelling reigned supreme, shaping perceptions and dictating truths. More recently, tangible, material evidence has gained considerable influence, offering a seemingly objective counterpoint. Yet, neither archive is truly complete in isolation. Stories act as vessels for human response, the fear, the interpretations, the adaptive strategies born from lived experience. They capture the subjective reality, the emotional landscape that colors events. Materials, on the other hand, retain the imprint of event itself, the force exerted, the impact sustained, the alterations wrought. They offer an unblinking gaze at the objective reality. Together, they approach a more comprehensive understanding of experience, though they never fully capture its elusive essence. As we delve deeper into this exploration, the focus shifts to the chasm between what truly happened and what was proclaimed to have happened. It's a gap defined by the space between land and language, between vulnerability exposed and judgments rendered. This gap, this liminal space, holds a significant portion of human history, sculpted by forces that often defy explanation and reshaped again by the inherent human need to reconcile with those forces. If meaning frequently emerges only after the fires of destruction have subsided, then perhaps the most intellectually honest question to ask isn't simply why did this destruction occur, but rather, how many of our explanations serve primarily to soothe our anxieties and allow us to continue living, rather than to truly understand the underlying causes? Explanation paves the way for inheritance. Stories aren't static entities that end the moment they're told. Instead, they seep into the consciousness of those who hear them, subtly shaping expectations long before conscious belief takes root. A child who grows up amidst ruins, surrounded by the stark reality of fragility, requires no explicit warnings. The very ground beneath their feet serves as a daily lesson. Conversely, a child raised on stories steeped in judgment learns a different set of truths. They learn that destruction is not random, but purposeful, that chaos can be categorized and labeled, that fear can be moralized, weaponized even. In this way, catastrophe gives birth not only to memory, but to an entire worldview. As centuries unfold, these worldviews crystallize, hardening into the bedrock of identity. A people becomes defined by what it believes saved them, or by what it believes destroyed others. The story of Sodom and Gomorrah, for example, transcends its literal depiction of fire and brimstone. It becomes a story about distinction, about boundaries. Who is deemed worthy of protection within the city walls, and who is left to face the perils outside? Who is spared, and who is erased from existence? This distinction offers a seductive form of reassurance. It implies that survival is not arbitrary, that there exists a discernible logic to endurance. If one aligns oneself correctly, if one adheres to the prescribed codes, the world will respond in kind. Yet, the soothing balm of reassurance has its limits. It works best when disaster is a distant specter, confined to the realm of theory, when the sky behaves predictably, and the land yields its bounty. But when catastrophe returns, rearing its head in stark reality, reassurance fractures, revealing its inherent fragility. In moments of genuine crisis, people often revert to older, more primal instincts that predate the carefully constructed edifice of explanation. They flee in panic. They huddle together for comfort and safety. They abandon their possessions in a desperate bid for survival. They seek higher ground, hoping to escape the impending threat. These instinctive responses are observed across diverse cultures and throughout history, transcending the boundaries of belief systems. They suggest that beneath the surface of carefully crafted stories lies something far more fundamental, a deeply ingrained memory of what works when the structures of civilization fail. The biblical account, with its stark simplicity, preserves this primal instinct with unusual clarity. There is no attempt to reform the doomed cities, no concerted effort to understand the nature of the fire that consumes them. There is only an overwhelming sense of urgency. Leave now. Do not look back. Do not linger. This urgency feels far older than any specific theology. It feels procedural, as if the narrative is simply carrying forward a rule learned through bitter experience. When certain uncrossable thresholds are breached, meaning becomes irrelevant. Immediate motion, unthinking action, becomes the only viable response. Over time, however, urgency morphs into symbol. The hard-won rule solidifies into a rigid lesson. Do not look back transforms from a practical survival instruction into a moral warning, laden with judgment. The shift is subtle, almost imperceptible, yet profoundly significant. It moves the story from the realm of the body, from pure instinct, into the realm of the conscience, where it can be repurposed and manipulated. Once safely ensconced in the conscience, the story can be repurposed for a multitude of agendas. It can be used to enforce conformity, to discourage dissent, to frame difference as inherent danger. The fire from the sky, once a terrifying force of nature, becomes a tool of persuasion, wielded to control behavior and maintain social order. This repurposing isn't necessarily malicious, born of conscious evil. It is, in its own way, adaptive. Societies use the tools at their disposal, and stories that command attention are inevitably used to maintain cohesion, to bind people together through shared beliefs and fears. But something essential is invariably lost in the process. The memory of scale, the sheer magnitude of the original event, is diminished. The original event, whatever it may have been, dwarfed human intention. It defied persuasion or correction. It arrived because a confluence of conditions aligned beyond human control. To reduce it to mere moral causality, to attribute it to human transgression, is to shrink it, to confine it within the limits of human systems, rendering it manageable and perhaps even repeatable. Shrinking catastrophe might provide a comforting illusion of control, but it comes at a steep price. When disaster is framed solely as punishment, people instinctively look for transgression, for someone to blame. When it's framed as a consequence of imbalance, they look for underlying patterns, for ways to restore equilibrium. These are fundamentally different responses. One seeks blame and retribution, the other seeks alignment and understanding. The Sumerian worldview, with its emphasis on cyclical patterns and inevitable resets, leans toward alignment. It accepts that human systems, however elaborate and sophisticated, exist within the context of larger, more powerful rhythms. When those rhythms shift, systems inevitably collapse. The collapse is not personal, not a reflection of individual morality. It is structural, a consequence of exceeding the limits of a particular configuration. This perspective is less comforting than the promise of divine protection, but it is arguably more durable. It does not promise safety, but it does promise awareness. The biblical worldview, in contrast, promises safety through a specific relationship, a covenant between humanity and the divine. When catastrophe breaches this covenant, the promise must be defended, the integrity of the relationship must be upheld. Judgment becomes the mechanism, the explanation that restores order and reaffirms the promise. Both approaches offer different pathways to survival. One trains attention, cultivating a keen awareness of environmental cues and potential threats. The other trains obedience, instilling a deep-seated adherence to prescribed codes of behavior. The inherent tension between these two approaches surfaces whenever new evidence emerges, challenging established narratives. Archaeological findings that suggest sudden destruction, for instance, challenge moral narratives that attribute catastrophe to human failing. They raise uncomfortable questions about fairness, responsibility, and the role of sheer chance in shaping human destiny. They reintroduce the unsettling possibility that some disasters are not messages at all, not divine pronouncements, but simply the result of impersonal forces operating beyond human comprehension. This possibility threatens any identity built on the foundation of meaning. If catastrophe can occur without reason, without regard for righteousness or wickedness, then survival becomes profoundly uncertain. If survival is uncertain, then belief systems must adapt once again, confronting the unsettling prospect of a world governed by chance rather than divine providence. Adaptation often takes the form of distance, a psychological buffer against the overwhelming reality of potential destruction. Catastrophe is relegated to the distant past, safely confined to the annals of history, or projected into the far-off future, a hypothetical threat that may or may not materialize. It becomes exceptional, an anomaly, rather than instructive, a recurring feature of the human experience. The present is declared safe by default, a temporary reprieve from the inevitable cycle of destruction and renewal. Yet, the land itself does not abide by human declarations. It responds to pressure, to the relentless forces of erosion and upheaval, not to the comforting illusions of belief. Salt accumulates in the soil, rendering it barren. Fault lines shift beneath the surface, waiting to unleash their pent-up energy. Objects fall from the sky, unbidden and unpredictable. In this sense, the story of Sodom and Gomorrah remains perpetually unresolved because the underlying conditions it gestures toward remain stubbornly active. The earth has not stabilized. The sky has not become predictable. Civilization continues to operate within a persistent state of uncertainty, even as it fervently pretends otherwise, clinging to the comforting illusion of control. Perhaps this is why the story refuses to close, why it resonates so powerfully across generations. It ends not with rebuilding or redemption, but with dispersal, with an unsettling silence, with a region irrevocably left behind. Silence is inherently uncomfortable. It invites interpretation, demanding to be filled with meaning. Over centuries, that filling takes many forms: moral pronouncements, symbolic interpretations, speculative theories. But silence also preserves something essential: space. Space allows memory to breathe, to evolve without being rigidly fixed. It allows fear to exist without hardening into inflexible doctrine. It allows for caution and preparedness without succumbing to constant alarm. In the quiet left by vanished cities, imagination continues to work, tirelessly seeking to make sense of the inexplicable. Scholars dig through the ruins, uncovering fragments of the past. Theologians argue over the meaning of the text, seeking to reconcile faith with destruction. Scientists measure the physical evidence, searching for clues to the underlying causes. Each group seeks to claim the story in their own language, to fit it within their own established frameworks. Yet none fully succeed. The fire, in this sense, remains unowned, refusing to be domesticated. It belongs neither to myth nor to data alone. It sits at the boundary, stubbornly resisting attempts to categorize and contain it. As we settle into this part of the journey, the feeling that emerges is not certainty, but humility, a profound recognition that some events simply exceed the frameworks we build to contain them. That meaning often follows impact, not the other way around. And if explanation is sometimes a way of coping, a psychological defense mechanism rather than a genuine quest for understanding, then perhaps the most faithful response to ancient catastrophe is not to resolve it definitively, to impose a neat and tidy conclusion, but to remain acutely aware of its far-reaching implications, to allow it to shape our understanding of the world and our place within it. Because beneath the stories we inherit, beneath the laws we obey, beneath the landscapes we inhabit, there remains the quiet, undeniable fact that not everything that ends does so for a reason we can readily name, a reason that fits neatly within our established frameworks. And living with that unsettling fact, embracing the inherent ambiguity of existence, may be the oldest and most fundamental lesson of all. When certainty begins to erode, when the comforting illusions of control begin to crumble, societies do not collapse immediately. Instead, they often tighten, instinctively reinforcing meanings that feel stable and pushing uncertainty to the very edges of thought, attempting to contain it within carefully constructed boundaries. This tightening is often subtle, almost imperceptible. It happens through repetition, through relentless emphasis on established narratives, through the quiet elevation of certain explanations over others, effectively silencing dissenting voices and alternative interpretations. After catastrophe, authority often speaks more clearly, not less, issuing commands with greater force and conviction. Interpretations narrow, becoming more rigid and inflexible. Ambiguity is treated as a sign of weakness, a threat to the established order. In moments when the world has proven demonstrably unpredictable, predictability itself becomes a moral value, a bulwark against the perceived chaos. Ancient civilizations understood this instinct intuitively. Kingship, priesthood, law each offered a way to anchor experience, to provide a sense of stability and order when the very ground beneath their feet had failed, when the foundations of their world had been shaken. If the sky could unleash fiery destruction without warning, obliterating entire cities without apparent cause, then meaning had to be secured elsewhere, in the rigid structures of hierarchy, in the comforting rituals of established religion, in the unwavering obedience to codified laws. Yet, this imposed security was never truly complete, never entirely successful in quelling the underlying unease. Beneath the reinforced surface, beneath the veneer of certainty, a persistent disquiet remained. Fire that arrives without negotiation, that ignores the pleas of the righteous and the sacrifices of the devout, leaves behind a permanent question mark, a lingering doubt that corrodes the foundations of belief. It raises the unsettling possibility that systems exist beyond human control, beyond the reach of appeal, operating according to principles that are fundamentally indifferent to human concerns. In Mesopotamian texts, this unease surfaces quietly, almost imperceptibly. The gods grant kingship, bestowing power and authority upon mortal rulers, then arbitrarily withdraw it, plunging kingdoms into chaos. Cities flourish for generations, then inexplicably disappear, swallowed by the sands of time. Authority is presented not as absolute and unchallengeable, but as borrowed, conditional, subject to the whims of the gods. The tone is resigned rather than outraged, as though instability were an expected, even an inevitable feature of existence, a fundamental characteristic of the cosmos. The biblical tradition, in contrast, resists this resignation, this acceptance of inherent instability. It insists on relationship, on the possibility of meaningful dialogue between humanity and the divine, on the belief that human actions can influence the course of events. Authority, in this framework, is not merely borrowed, a temporary grant subject to arbitrary withdrawal. It is bestowed with purpose, a sacred trust that carries with it both privilege and responsibility. When catastrophe occurs, it must therefore be explained as a rupture in that relationship, a consequence of human transgression that has severed the bond between humanity and the divine. The destruction of Sodom and Gomorrah, with its swift and merciless judgment, fits uneasily within this framework, raising uncomfortable questions about divine justice and the limits of human understanding. The cities are condemned, their fate sealed by their wickedness, but the narrative does not linger on investigation, does not delve into the complexities of human behavior or explore the nuances of moral judgment. There is no extended inquiry into the specific causes of their downfall, no communal reckoning to determine the extent of their guilt. The event is decisive, final, and quickly sealed, as if to prevent further scrutiny. This speed is revealing, suggesting a deep-seated discomfort with the implications of the event, a reluctance to dwell on the unsettling questions it raises. To linger would be to invite doubt, to question whether the simplistic narrative of judgment fully accounts for the complexities of what occurred, to acknowledge the possibility that other factors, beyond human control, may have played a role. Silence becomes protective, a shield against the corrosive effects of doubt. Afterward, the land itself is left untouched, a desolate wasteland bearing silent witness to the catastrophe. No prophet is sent to interpret its ruins, to glean lessons from its desolation. No attempt is made to reclaim its space, to rebuild and repopulate the destroyed cities. The story withdraws, leaving behind a void, a blank space that resists interpretation. That void functions as a boundary, a limit to human understanding. It marks a place where explanation stops, where narrative refuses to follow, where the tidy narratives of judgment and retribution falter and fail. Boundaries like this appear throughout history, marking events that are acknowledged but not examined, traumas that are commemorated but not discussed, uncomfortable truths that are deliberately ignored. The boundary preserves continuity by limiting inquiry, preventing the spread of doubt and uncertainty. Civilizations depend on such boundaries to maintain their stability, to protect their established narratives from the corrosive effects of questioning. Without them, doubt would spread too freely, undermining the foundations of belief and eroding the structures of social order. Life would become unmanageable, a constant struggle against the forces of chaos. But boundaries also hide information, preventing learning and perpetuating ignorance. They ensure that certain patterns remain unexamined, that certain questions remain unasked. The physical world, however, does not respect these artificial boundaries. It continues to record what occurred, regardless of whether it is interpreted or acknowledged. Layers of sediment accumulate, preserving the evidence of past events. Minerals transform, revealing the chemical composition of the soil. Absence persists, marking the spaces where life once thrived. Modern methods of inquiry, such as archaeology and geology, bring these hidden records back into view, challenging inherited explanations and reopening sealed questions. They do not replace meaning with certainty, providing definitive answers to age-old mysteries. Instead, they replace certainty with possibility, expanding the realm of human understanding and forcing us to confront the limitations of our knowledge. This reopening is inherently uncomfortable, mirroring the original unease that boundaries were built to contain, challenging the foundations of established belief. It suggests that the event remembered as divine judgment may have been something more indifferent, more impersonal, more difficult to integrate into a coherent worldview. If fire erases cities because of alignment, because of a confluence of impersonal forces rather than divine intention, then survival becomes less about righteousness and more about position, less about obedience and more about awareness. This shift threatens established frameworks, undermining the comforting illusions of moral certainty and introducing a sense of vulnerability that cannot be managed through behavior alone. Ancient societies may have sensed this danger instinctively. Their reluctance to describe certain catastrophes in detail, their deliberate ambiguity in recounting the events of the past, may reflect not ignorance or lack of understanding, but a conscious caution, a recognition that too much clarity could destabilize belief and erode the foundations of social order. In this sense, ambiguity is not failure, not a sign of incomplete knowledge. It is design, a deliberate strategy to preserve stability in the face of unsettling truths. The Sumerian approach, with its emphasis on cycles and resets, allows ambiguity to exist without triggering a crisis of faith. Eras end, new ones begin, and the reasons for these transitions are not always known. Acceptance replaces explanation, embracing the inherent mystery of existence. The biblical approach, oriented toward continuity and divine providence, struggles more with ambiguity. It needs stories to resolve tension, to provide closure and reaffirm the belief in a just and ordered universe. Judgment serves this role, restoring order by assigning cause, attributing catastrophe to human transgression. Yet even here, traces of acceptance remain, subtle acknowledgments of the limits of human understanding. The destruction of Sodom and Gomorrah is not debated or reinterpreted later. It stands as a closed chapter, a settled matter. Closure, however, does not necessarily equate to understanding. It often means containment, a deliberate effort to suppress doubt and prevent further inquiry. Over generations, containment becomes tradition, an unquestioned practice passed down from one generation to the next. The story is retold, but its edges are smoothed, its sharpest implications are dulled, and the land, the physical reality of the event, fades into the background, becoming a mere backdrop to the moral lesson. What survives is the lesson, the abstract principle, not the raw, visceral experience of the event itself. But lessons age differently than events. They adapt to new contexts, shifting emphasis and sometimes even reversing meaning, bending to the prevailing ideologies of the time. The story of Sodom and Gomorrah, for example, has been used to condemn behaviors that bear little resemblance to the ancient context, to justify prejudice and discrimination against marginalized groups. It has traveled far from its ground, from the specific historical and geographical context that gave rise to it. The ground, meanwhile, remains where it is, altered by the passage of time, resistant to human attempts to tame it, stubbornly silent in the face of human interpretation. This separation between story and sight, between the narrative and the physical reality, grows wider with time, as fewer and fewer people stand where the cities once stood, breathing the air and feeling the atmosphere. The narrative floats free, untethered from its original context, susceptible to endless reinterpretation and manipulation. When archaeology and geology attempt to reconnect narrative and sight, to ground the story in the physical reality of the past, tension inevitably returns, challenging established interpretations and forcing us to confront uncomfortable truths. The possibility that the story began as memory, as a flawed and incomplete recollection of actual events, rather than as a divinely inspired metaphor, re-enters awareness, undermining the foundations of unquestioning belief. This possibility does not invalidate belief, rendering it false or meaningless. It complicates it, adding layers of nuance and forcing us to grapple with the limitations of human understanding. It suggests that meaning may have been layered on top of experience, constructed after the fact in an attempt to make sense of the inexplicable, rather than arising organically from it. Layering is not deception, not a deliberate attempt to mislead or obscure the truth. It is survival, a necessary adaptation to the harsh realities of existence. Humans need stories that allow them to continue living after disaster, to find meaning and purpose in the face of overwhelming loss. Pure memory, unadulterated by interpretation, is often too heavy to carry, too painful to bear. The question, then, becomes not whether the story is true or false, whether it accurately reflects the events of the past, but what function it served at different moments in history, what needs it met and what purposes it served. For ancient witnesses, it may have been a way to mark loss without reopening terror, to acknowledge the devastation without reliving the trauma. For later generations, it may have been a way to teach boundaries, to reinforce social norms and maintain order. For modern readers, it may be a mirror reflecting the unresolved tension between explanation and uncertainty, between the human need for meaning and the limitations of human knowledge. As we settle into this part of the journey, attention returns to that tension, to the discomfort that arises when inherited meaning meets material evidence, when cherished beliefs are challenged by new discoveries. It returns to the quiet recognition that not all answers are recoverable, that some mysteries will forever remain beyond our grasp. Perhaps the persistence of this story, its enduring power to captivate and unsettle, is not due to its clarity, to its ability to provide definitive answers, but to its refusal to fully explain itself, to its deliberate ambiguity. It leaves space for doubt, for reinterpretation, for unease, forcing us to confront the limits of our understanding and to grapple with the inherent uncertainties of existence. And if some events remain beyond the reach of explanation, if some mysteries refuse to yield their secrets, then the task of memory is not to resolve them, to impose a false sense of closure, but to hold them carefully, to preserve their ambiguity and allow their implications to shape humility rather than certainty, to foster a deeper appreciation for the complexities of the world and our place within it. Because beneath every structure built to protect meaning, beneath every carefully constructed system of belief, lies the same unsteady ground, the same volatile earth that has been shaped by forces beyond human control. And sometimes, the most honest inheritance a civilization can pass down is not an answer, a definitive solution to the mysteries of existence, but an awareness of limits, a recognition that there are boundaries beyond which human understanding cannot reach. When endurance replaces certainty, when the focus shifts from seeking absolute truth to cultivating resilience in the face of uncertainty, a civilization begins to listen differently, not for promises of divine intervention or guarantees of future prosperity, but for limits, for the subtle signs that indicate impending danger. The world is no longer expected to cooperate indefinitely, to bend to the will of humanity. It is observed with careful scrutiny, measured in subtle signs, approached with caution and respect, earned through hard-won experience and the acceptance of inevitable loss. This shift does not announce itself with fanfare or revolution. It settles quietly into behavior, subtly altering the way people interact with the world around them. Ancient communities that survived abrupt destruction often developed a subdued relationship with the future, tempering their ambitions and tempering their expectations. Hope remained, but it was tempered by a deep awareness of the fragility of existence and the inherent unpredictability of the cosmos. Expansion was no longer assumed to be virtuous, a sign of progress and divine favor. Density was no longer synonymous with strength, a measure of civilization's power and resilience. What mattered was continuity under constraint, the ability to maintain their culture and their way of life within the limitations imposed by a harsh and unforgiving environment. In stories shaped by such experiences, endings are sharp and decisive, not gradual and fading. They do not fade into a gentle twilight. They arrive suddenly, without warning, shattering the illusion of continuity and forcing a reckoning with the stark realities of existence. The destruction of Sodom and Gomorrah exemplifies this sharpness, this abrupt transition from existence to non-existence. There is no prologue of decline, no gradual deterioration of social order, no accumulation of warning signs that presage the impending doom. There is no epilogue of repair, no gradual rebuilding and restoration of the destroyed cities. One moment the cities exist, bustling with life and commerce, and the next moment they do not, reduced to smoldering ruins. The narrative insists on immediacy, on the sudden and irreversible nature of the catastrophe. This insistence may preserve a collective memory of thresholds crossed too quickly for adjustment, a point where incremental correction was no longer possible, where the forces of destruction had gained an irreversible momentum. When conditions align beyond tolerance, when the delicate balance of a complex system is disrupted beyond repair, systems fail completely, collapsing under their own weight. The difficulty of accepting this possibility cannot be overstated. Humans rely on the fundamental belief that warning proceeds collapse, that error accumulates gradually, providing ample opportunity for detection and correction. That time remains available for response, for mitigating the consequences of our actions and averting impending disaster. Sudden endings threaten this belief at its very root, undermining the foundations of our sense of control and order. Sumerian cosmology accommodates suddenness without protest, accepting it as an inherent feature of the universe. Eras end, new ones begin, and the reasons for these transitions are not always known. Knowledge does not guarantee foresight, and wisdom does not guarantee survival. This worldview does not console, offering false promises of protection and divine favor. Instead, it prepares, fostering resilience and adaptability in the face of inevitable change. The biblical worldview, in contrast, seeks consolation through relationship, through the covenant between humanity and the divine. Covenant promises that behavior matters, that human actions have consequences, that outcomes can be negotiated through prayer and repentance. When catastrophe intrudes, threatening to shatter the illusion of divine protection, the promise must be preserved through interpretation, through the imposition of meaning onto seemingly random events. In the Sodom narrative, interpretation is swift and decisive. Judgment is named, attributed to the wickedness of the inhabitants. The story moves forward, leaving the devastated land behind. Yet, the land does not conform to this tidy narrative of closure. Its barrenness persists, defying the notion that divine justice has been fully satisfied. Its waters remain hostile, resisting attempts to cultivate them. Its atmosphere resists habitation, rendering it uninhabitable for human beings. The catastrophe lingers as condition rather than event, a permanent scar on the landscape that refuses to heal. This persistence complicates moral framing, challenging the easy answers of judgment and retribution. If destruction was corrective, intended to punish the wicked and restore order, why does correction not restore the land to its former state of fertility and abundance? If judgment was complete and just, why does the land remain altered, a permanent reminder of the devastation that has occurred? Such questions may explain the narrative's restraint, its deliberate silence regarding the aftermath of the destruction. The text does not dwell on the consequences of the catastrophe, does not revisit the site to assess the damage or offer explanations for its persistence. It allows the land to remain silent, its secrets locked within its barren soil. Silence here is not absence of meaning, a sign of ignorance or indifference. It is containment, a conscious effort to suppress doubt and maintain the integrity of the narrative. It is a recognition that some consequences exceed explanation, that some mysteries are best left unexamined. Over time, this containment becomes tradition, an unquestioned practice passed down from one generation to the next. The story is retold, but its edges soften, its sharpest implications are dulled, and the land fades into symbol, becoming a mere representation of divine judgment rather than a concrete reality. The event becomes emblematic rather than particular, a generalized warning about the dangers of sin rather than a specific account of a historical catastrophe. Symbols travel easily, transcending the boundaries of time and place. They adapt to new contexts, taking on new meanings and serving new purposes. They are useful tools for teaching moral lessons and reinforcing social norms. But they also detach from the conditions that gave rise to them, losing their connection to the physical reality of the past. Detachment has a cost. When catastrophe is abstracted, when it becomes a symbol rather than a lived experience, its lessons become generic, losing their specific relevance. They warn about behavior rather than environment, about morality rather than alignment, focusing on individual transgression rather than systemic vulnerability. Alignment, however, is where endurance often resides, where the seeds of survival are sown. Alignment with geography, understanding the terrain and its limitations. Alignment with climate, adapting to seasonal changes and extreme weather events. Alignment with thresholds that do not negotiate, recognizing the boundaries beyond which human systems cannot function. Modern systems analysis returns to this ancient insight through different language, using the tools of science and technology to quantify the complex interactions that govern the natural world. It speaks of tipping points, critical thresholds beyond which a system undergoes irreversible change. It speaks of feedback loops, complex chains of causation that amplify or dampen the effects of change. It speaks of irreversible change, transformations that cannot be undone, regardless of human intervention. These concepts echo ancient intuitions, translating the accumulated wisdom of generations into the language of measurement. Once a threshold is crossed, adjustment is no longer incremental, a matter of fine-tuning existing systems. The system reorganizes itself, shifting to a new equilibrium. Recovery, if it occurs at all, follows a new logic, requiring a fundamental rethinking of existing strategies and a willingness to adapt to new realities. Ancient people may not have named this process with scientific precision, but they recognized its effects, observing the patterns of collapse and renewal that shaped their world. They moved away from failed sites, abandoning settlements that had become unsustainable. They avoided certain lands, recognizing the inherent dangers of inhabiting unstable regions. They encoded caution into movement and settlement, shaping their cultural practices to minimize risk and maximize resilience. In the Sodom story, survival depends on relocation, not reform, not resistance. Leaving is the only viable response, the only path to safety. This emphasis on departure is often overlooked, overshadowed by the moralizing interpretations that dominate the narrative. It suggests that some dangers cannot be mitigated from within, that some threats require disengagement. Disengagement is difficult, demanding significant sacrifices. It demands loss of familiarity, relinquishing the comforts of home and the security of established routines. It demands loss of investment, abandoning the fruits of years of labor and the infrastructure that supports their way of life. It demands loss of identity, severing ties to the land and the community that have shaped their sense of self. It asks people to abandon what they have built, both physically and culturally, to embrace the unknown and start anew. The story preserves this difficulty in the figure who looks back, the one who hesitates to leave, clinging to the past even as it crumbles around them. The impulse to witness, to confirm, to hold on to what is disappearing, is a deeply human one, rooted in our attachment to place and our fear of the unknown. It is also hazardous when conditions have irreversibly shifted, when the old rules no longer apply. The transformation that follows is not moral commentary, a punishment for disobedience. It is consequence, a physical manifestation of the irreversible changes that have occurred. Attachment arrests motion, preventing the necessary adaptation to new circumstances. Motion was required, a swift and decisive break from the past. Over generations, this procedural memory, this ingrained understanding of the necessity of movement, becomes moralized, imbued with religious significance. Do not look back transforms from a practical instruction, a survival strategy in the face of immediate danger, into a lesson about obedience, a test of faith. The context recedes, fading into the background, and the instruction remains, a timeless commandment that transcends its original purpose. Yet beneath the moral layer, the procedural logic persists, a subtle reminder of the inherent dangers of hesitation. When thresholds close, when opportunities for escape vanish, hesitation carries cost, potentially leading to destruction. This logic appears in many disaster narratives across cultures, recurring in stories of floods, fires, collapses, and other cataclysmic events. Survivors describe moments when explanation ceased to matter, when the search for meaning became irrelevant. Action mattered, a swift and decisive response to the immediate threat. The persistence of this emphasis on action suggests that beneath the complex layers of cultural interpretation, there lies a universal understanding of the fundamental requirements for survival in the face of overwhelming disaster. Logic, it suggests, points away from the realm of ideology and towards the school of raw experience. This understanding isn't born of abstract theory but from the visceral encounters with sheer, overwhelming scale. Scale, in its immensity, dwarfs intention. The most meticulously crafted plans, the most fervent desires, are rendered insignificant against its backdrop. Debate becomes irrelevant, mere whispers in the face of a roaring storm. The only rational response is recognition of limits, of the boundaries beyond which human agency falters. The land surrounding the ruins of Sodom and Gomorrah serves as a constant, unwavering enforcer of this recognition. Attempts to normalize it, to domesticate its harsh reality, inevitably fail. The environment itself resists such efforts, pushing back against any imposition of order or normalcy. It subtly, yet persistently, reminds visitors that not all spaces are neutral, that some places carry a weight of consequence that cannot be ignored. This reminder operates outside the realm of narrative. It requires no story, no argument, no justification. It simply is. Human narratives, in stark contrast, are fundamentally dependent on justification to function. They seek meaning, a framework within which to understand and sustain identity. They cannot endure indefinitely within a state of unshielded exposure, naked before the elements and the weight of history. The tension between the land and the story is therefore unavoidable, an inherent conflict between two opposing forces. The land preserves consequence, etching the scars of the past into its very fabric. The story, on the other hand, preserves continuity, weaving a thread of meaning that connects the present to the past and offers hope for the future. When modern inquiry attempts to reconcile these opposing forces, it often privileges one over the other, seeking to reduce the complexity of the situation to a single, digestible explanation. Either the story is interpreted as purely symbolic, a metaphorical representation of deeper truths, or the land is dismissed as incidental, a mere backdrop to the human drama. Such simplification, however, misses the crucial interaction between the two. The story may be symbolic precisely because the land made symbolism necessary, because the scale of the disaster was so overwhelming that it could only be approached through metaphor and allegory. Conversely, the land may be central because the story could not fully absorb the totality of what occurred, because the reality was too immense, too horrific, to be contained within the confines of human narrative. Together, the land and the story outline an experience that remains fundamentally incomplete, a puzzle with missing pieces. As civilizations mature, they often fall prey to the assumption that this incompleteness can be resolved through the accumulation of knowledge, through the gathering of more data, the construction of better models, and the development of improved foresight. These tools undoubtedly matter. They extend awareness, allowing us to perceive and understand the world with greater clarity. But they do not eliminate thresholds. They do not grant immunity from the consequences of our actions. Therefore, the ancient posture of restraint may remain profoundly relevant, not as a form of passive resignation, but as a vital orientation. An orientation toward watching rather than assuming, toward movement rather than attachment, toward humility rather than certainty. The enduring power of the Sodom story may lie not in its moral claims, in its pronouncements of right and wrong, but in its preservation of exposure, in its unflinching depiction of vulnerability. It reminds listeners that systems can fail abruptly, that survival sometimes requires disengagement, that meaning often follows impact, emerging from the ashes of devastation. As this part of the journey concludes, the atmosphere grows quieter, the air less charged with judgment, more attentive to the prevailing conditions. The focus shifts away from blame and toward alignment, a recognition of the need to harmonize with the forces at play. If there is wisdom to be carried forward from cities erased by fire, it may not be a set of rigid rules to obey, but a posture to inhabit, a way of being in the world. One that acknowledges limits before they announce themselves, that values motion when stasis becomes dangerous, that understands that not every ending arrives with warning, and that endurance often belongs to those who recognize when to let go. And in that recognition, a quieter form of continuity persists. Not guaranteed, not permanent, but attentive enough to survive another cycle, to navigate the ever-shifting landscape of existence. Letting go is rarely described as wisdom. It feels more like loss, like failure, like the admission that effort has its limits. Yet, across the long stretches of human memory, survival has often depended on precisely this capacity, the ability to release what no longer aligns with the world as it has become. Civilizations, however, tend to favor stories of endurance through resistance. Walls held, cities rebuilt, order restored. These narratives reassure, implying that persistence alone guarantees continuity. But beneath these celebrated tales runs a quieter record, one less frequently acknowledged. Survival through withdrawal, through the act of stepping away from what is no longer sustainable. After landscapes are altered beyond the point of recovery, those who endure do not always return to rebuild what was lost. They resettle, seeking new ground, new opportunities. They adapt to new conditions, embracing the changes that have been wrought. They carry fragments of the past forward, weaving them into the fabric of their new lives. But they do not insist on restoring everything exactly as it was. The memory of Sodom and Gomorrah preserves this quieter pattern. The cities are not mourned through rebuilding, through attempts to resurrect what has been destroyed. Their names remain, echoing through the ages, but their spaces are abandoned, left to the forces of nature. What survives is not architecture, not physical presence, but warning, a cautionary tale whispered across generations. What endures is not presence, but distance, a deliberate separation from a place deemed uninhabitable. Distance is an underappreciated form of knowledge, a strategy for survival often overlooked in the pursuit of control and dominance. It allows systems to stabilize elsewhere, to regroup and rebuild in safer environments. It prevents repeated exposure to conditions that have proven hostile, breaking the cycle of destruction and allowing for a fresh start. It accepts that some places, once irrevocably changed, cannot be reclaimed without a cost exceeding the potential benefit, without sacrificing too much in the attempt to recover what is lost. Ancient cultures often encoded this acceptance through taboo, through unspoken prohibitions and carefully observed boundaries. Certain lands were avoided, deemed cursed or haunted. Certain waters were left untouched, their depths shrouded in mystery and fear. These prohibitions were not always explained, their origins lost to time. They did not need to be. The very absence of explanation preserved compliance more effectively than any lengthy debate or explicit pronouncement. The fear of the unknown, the weight of tradition, proved more powerful than reason. Over time, as direct memory faded, as the first-hand experience of the disaster receded into the mists of the past, taboo transformed into symbolism. Avoided places became cursed, their dangers magnified and embellished in the telling of stories. Distance became moral separation, a way of distinguishing between the righteous and the wicked. What began as a practical environmental adaptation, a strategy for survival in a harsh and unforgiving world, hardened into a narrative boundary, a line drawn in the sand between those who were safe and those who were doomed. This hardening created clarity, providing a framework for understanding the world and one's place within it. But it also obscured the original impetus, the underlying reason for the avoidance. The land was avoided not because it was inherently unstable, but because it was judged, because it had been deemed sinful and deserving of punishment. The danger was relocated from condition to character, from the forces of nature to the moral failings of humanity. Relocation of danger is comforting. It implies that safety can be secured through behavior alone, that catastrophe belongs only to the disobedient, to those who stray from the prescribed path. It offers a sense of control in a world that often feels chaotic and unpredictable. Yet this comfort is fragile, an illusion that crumbles when conditions change without regard for virtue, when disaster strikes indiscriminately, regardless of moral standing. In such moments, the older logic reasserts itself, the primal instinct for survival overriding the ingrained narratives of blame and punishment. People flee, abandoning their structures, their possessions, their carefully constructed lives. They seek new ground, new opportunities, a chance to rebuild in a safer environment. Meaning follows later, emerging from the chaos and uncertainty in the form of stories and explanations. The biblical account of escape from Sodom retains this older logic with striking purity. The urgency is absolute, allowing for no hesitation or deliberation. There is no preparation, no ritual, no attempt to preserve artifacts or salvage belongings. Survival demands speed, a swift and decisive response to the immediate threat. Speed here is not recklessness, a blind rush into the unknown. It is recognition, a clear-eyed assessment of the situation and an understanding of the stakes involved. Recognition that conditions have crossed a threshold, that a point has been reached where deliberation no longer serves, where the time for planning and strategizing has passed. This recognition is not primarily intellectual, a reasoned conclusion arrived at through careful analysis. It is bodily, an instinctive response rooted in the deepest recesses of the brain. It is the same instinct that compels movement during an earthquake or fire, the primal urge to flee from danger. Thought lags behind action, the body responding before the mind has fully grasped the situation. Stories that preserve this instinct often appear abrupt, even cruel, lacking in nuance and compassion. They offer no consolation, no comforting words for those left behind. They do not allow for reflection or regret, but their harshness may reflect fidelity to experience rather than indifference to suffering, a commitment to portraying the reality of the situation as it was felt in the moment. Experience teaches that when environments reorganize suddenly, when the familiar structures of life are upended without warning, attachment becomes hazardous, a liability that can drag one down and prevent escape. The longer one remains, clinging to the past, the narrower the options become, the more difficult it is to break free. The image of looking back, Lot's wife frozen in salt, captures this danger precisely. It is not mere curiosity that condemns her, but delay, the inability to fully relinquish the past. The moment spent turning back, the brief hesitation, is the moment lost, the opportunity to escape forfeited. Over centuries, this image becomes moralized, laden with symbolic meaning. Obedience replaces timing as the central virtue, the willingness to follow instructions without question becoming paramount. But the underlying principle remains. Survival depends on recognizing when the past can no longer be recovered, when it is time to move on and embrace the uncertainty of the future. It punishes those who break rules, not those who misunderstand the way systems work. This suggests a belief that safety is guaranteed by strict adherence to correctness, rather than by astute awareness and understanding of the underlying dynamics at play. But history is replete with examples that challenge this comforting illusion. Cities crumble despite meticulous order and planning. Societies collapse despite the best of intentions and noble aspirations. Systems fail not necessarily due to immorality or malice, but because of the relentless accumulation of stress and pressure, reaching a critical breaking point where the entire structure gives way. And when this happens, that older, more primal intuition reemerges, bubbling to the surface of our collective consciousness. People speak of being caught completely off guard, of circumstances shifting far more rapidly than anticipated, of realizing, often too late, that the very ground beneath their feet had subtly, irrevocably shifted. These expressions, echoing the ancient experiences of our ancestors, resonate even in the most advanced and technologically sophisticated modern contexts. They reveal an underlying continuity that persists beneath the surface of superficial differences. The enduring story of Sodom and Gomorrah may resonate so deeply because it so powerfully preserves this sense of continuity. It compresses the complex experience of sudden and catastrophic reversal into a concise and easily recalled narrative, a cautionary tale that can be accessed when needed, even if its original and intended meaning has been obscured or layered over with subsequent interpretations. Its power, therefore, lies not in providing a simple explanation or a neat solution, but in fostering recognition, a deep, visceral understanding that stability is often far more fragile than it appears and can vanish with startling rapidity. That warnings do not always arrive in advance, blaring like sirens in the night. That survival sometimes hinges not on steadfast correction of course, but on swift and decisive movement, a willingness to abandon the familiar in the face of overwhelming threat. As societies advance technologically, this crucial recognition becomes increasingly difficult to maintain. Systems grow ever more complex, layered with intricate dependencies. Buffers increase, insulating us from immediate consequences. Feedback is delayed, blurring cause and effect. And confidence, often misplaced, expands exponentially, leading to a dangerous sense of invulnerability. In such a climate, stories serve as vital counterweights, reminding us of our inherent fragility. They interrupt the comfortable yet ultimately false assumptions of immunity. They whisper of vulnerability in cultures built on the illusion of absolute control, reminding us that hubris often precedes a fall. But whispers, by their very nature, can be easily ignored. They can be recited without truly being heard, their meaning lost in the din of modern life. The land, however, continues to speak in its own way, through the unyielding language of condition, through the stark realities of scarcity, through the relentless force of resistance, and through the devastating impact of sudden and unexpected change. The Dead Sea Basin remains one such powerful voice, a silent testament to the forces that shape our world. It does not offer a comforting narrative with easy answers. Instead, it offers constraint, a stark reminder of limits. It enforces memory through persistence, not through eloquent persuasion. And in this persistence lies a profound challenge to all inherited interpretations, be they moral, symbolic, or purely speculative. The land asks not to be blindly believed, but to be reckoned with, to be understood on its own terms. Modern societies often struggle with this form of reckoning, preferring to fix what is broken rather than adapt to new realities, to restore what has been lost rather than withdraw gracefully, to assert continuity even where discontinuity has already irrevocably occurred. This struggle reflects a deeper discomfort, a fundamental unease, with the very concept of limits. Limits, after all, undermine the illusion of mastery. They force the uncomfortable acknowledgement of our dependence on systems that are far beyond our control, forces that can overwhelm even the most carefully laid plans. Ancient cultures, living in far closer proximity to the raw volatility of the natural world, may have integrated the concept of limits more fully into their worldview, accepting it as an inherent part of existence. Their stories, therefore, do not promise absolute safety or guaranteed outcomes. Instead, they offer orientation, a framework for navigating a world fraught with peril. Orientation, in this context, is a subtle and nuanced understanding. It does not prevent catastrophe from striking, but it shapes our response to it, allowing us to react with greater wisdom and resilience. The orientation preserved in the story of Sodom is not one of despair, but of readiness, a willingness to move when conditions no longer support life as it is known, a readiness to accept loss without stubbornly insisting on restoration, a readiness to adapt and evolve in the face of overwhelming change. This readiness does not erase grief or diminish sorrow. It carries grief forward, transforming it into a source of strength and resilience, preventing it from becoming a paralyzing force that prevents us from moving forward. In later retellings, this crucial readiness often becomes obscured by layers of judgment and moralizing. The focus shifts to assigning fault, to determining who deserves what, to viewing the outcome as a definitive verdict. Yet, beneath the layers of moralizing, the underlying readiness remains encoded, waiting to be rediscovered. It surfaces when systems are stretched to their breaking point, when environments undergo radical transformation, when critical thresholds are approached. In these moments, people instinctively rediscover the old logic, often without even being able to articulate it consciously. They evacuate, they relocate, they abandon what cannot be saved. Afterward, explanations multiply, fueled by a need to make sense of the chaos. Blame is assigned, often unfairly. Meaning is painstakingly constructed, often retrospectively. But survival itself has already occurred, guided by something far older and more profound than rational explanation. As this part of the journey nears its conclusion, attention turns toward that guiding undercurrent, that quiet intelligence that operates beneath the surface of conscious belief. It is the memory that does not speak in words, but acts decisively in moments of crisis. If civilizations inherit anything truly durable from ancient catastrophes, it may be this undercurrent, not a rigid doctrine, but a flexible disposition. A disposition characterized by attentiveness rather than blind certainty, toward decisive movement rather than rigid fixation, toward humility in the face of systems far larger and more complex than our own intentions. The cities erased by fire may no longer exist in the physical world, but the conditions that led to their destruction have not disappeared from the world. They have merely changed form, evolving and adapting to new contexts. In this sense, the story remains unfinished, a work in progress. Not because it lacks a definitive ending, but because its implications continue to unfold, resonating across time and cultures. And if history is less a sequence of neatly packaged lessons learned than a complex rhythm of forgetting and remembering, then the true value of such stories may lie in their ability to restore awareness just before it is desperately needed, awareness that some endings arrive without negotiation, without warning. Awareness that alignment with the forces of nature matters far more than stubborn argument. Awareness that survival, when it comes, often belongs to those who recognize when staying has become the greater risk. And in that awareness, a quieter continuity persists, one not guaranteed by brute strength or unwavering virtue, but sustained by the willingness to move with the world as it changes, rather than insisting that it remain forever as it was. At the end of every long and winding memory lies a question that cannot be answered directly, a question that probes the depths of our understanding. It does not ask for easily verifiable facts, or neatly defined names, or precisely recorded dates. It asks something far quieter, something far more profound. What remains after certainty dissolves? When the fire has passed, leaving only ashes in its wake. When cities have vanished, swallowed by the earth. When explanations have hardened into dogma and then thinned again with the passage of time, what persists is not a concrete conclusion, but a posture, a way of standing in the world shaped by awareness rather than brittle assurance. The story of Sodom and Gomorrah does not conclude with a triumphant restoration. It does not offer redemption through rebuilding. It ends with dispersal, with silence, with a land left behind, irrevocably altered. This ending is unusual, unsettling, and perhaps deliberately so. It resists the all-too-human preference for closure, for a neat and tidy resolution. Closure suggests mastery, control, a sense that an event has been fully absorbed, completely understood, and definitively resolved. But some events, by their very nature, refuse such treatment. They remain incomplete, not because information is missing, but because their profound implications simply cannot be contained within a single, limited frame of reference. Ancient cultures may have understood this intuitively, recognizing the limitations of human understanding in the face of overwhelming forces. Their stories, therefore, often end not with definitive answers, but with thresholds, with boundaries drawn where inquiry must stop, not out of ignorance, but out of a profound respect for scale, for the sheer immensity of the forces at play. The fire that erased cities from the collective memory of the ancient world did more than simply destroy structures of stone and mortar. It exposed a fundamental limit of human planning, of morality, of foresight. It revealed, in stark and unforgiving terms, that human systems, no matter how sophisticated, operate within the context of far larger and more complex dynamics that do not readily explain themselves. This revelation is deeply unsettling. It undermines our carefully constructed confidence in progress as an infallible safeguard. It questions the comforting assumption that knowledge always arrives in time to avert disaster. It suggests, instead, that survival sometimes depends less on comprehensive understanding and far more on immediate responsiveness, on the ability to adapt and react swiftly to unforeseen circumstances. Responsiveness, in this context, does not require absolute certainty. It requires attentiveness, a deep and unwavering focus on the world around us. Throughout this journey, attentiveness has appeared again and again as a quiet inheritance, passed down through generations. In the willingness to embrace movement rather than cling to rigid doctrine, in the wisdom to choose avoidance over reckless conquest, in the power of stories that warn without fully explaining, the Sumerian records, fragmentary and restrained, preserve this attentiveness by refusing to completely moralize catastrophe. The biblical narrative preserves it by encoding urgency and departure, even as it attempts to frame meaning more tightly within a moral framework. Neither tradition offers comfort in the modern sense of the word. Neither promises immunity from the forces of nature or the consequences of our own actions. Both, instead, gesture toward exposure, toward the inherent vulnerability of the human condition. Exposure is difficult to live with. It invites anxiety, fear, and a constant sense of unease. It resists control, challenging our deepest desires for order and predictability. And so, across centuries, countless layers of interpretation have been added to these ancient stories, each intended to soften the harsh edges of reality, to mitigate the fear, to impose a sense of order on the chaos. Moral frameworks, symbolic interpretations, doctrinal certainties, these layers are understandable, perhaps even necessary. They help societies function, providing a shared sense of meaning and purpose. They allow daily life to proceed without the constant and debilitating awareness of our own fragility. Yet fragility does not simply disappear when it is unacknowledged. It merely waits, lurking beneath the surface of our carefully constructed illusions, ready to reemerge when conditions are right. The land associated with Sodom and Gomorrah continues to bear silent witness to this waiting. Not dramatically, with fiery displays or earth-shattering tremors, but persistently, through its barrenness, through its chemical imbalance, through its stubborn resistance to habitation. The land does not accuse. It does not explain. It simply remains altered, irrevocably changed by the forces that have shaped it. In this, it mirrors the deepest layer of the story itself. Beneath the layers of judgment, beneath the intricate symbolism, beneath the endless debates and interpretations, there is alteration, a fundamental discontinuity. A before and an after that do not reconnect, a rupture in the fabric of reality. Perhaps this is why the story endures across cultures and eras, resonating with audiences separated by vast distances of time and geography. Not because it provides easy answers to difficult questions, but because it preserves the memory of disconnection from place, from certainty, from the comforting assumption that continuity is guaranteed. In modern times, this memory feels increasingly relevant, more urgent than ever before. Systems once assumed to be stable reveal alarming signs of stress. Climate shifts accelerate, exceeding even the most dire predictions. Feedback loops tighten, amplifying the consequences of our actions. Thresholds approach quietly, without fanfare, often without even being noticed until it is too late. Once again, societies search for explanations, for someone to blame, for reassurance that everything will be all right. And once again, there is a very real risk of mistaking explanation for protection, of believing that simply understanding the problem will somehow magically solve it. The ancient posture of restraint offers a powerful alternative, a path forward that avoids both the pitfalls of blind optimism and the paralysis of despair. Not resignation to inevitable doom, but a clear-eyed awareness of the challenges that lie ahead. Not despair in the face of overwhelming odds, but a grounded realism that allows us to make informed choices. Restraint does not mean refusing to build, to create, to progress. It means building with the understanding that our structures are provisional, subject to the forces of nature and the passage of time. It means recognizing that location matters, that some places are inherently more vulnerable than others. It means recognizing that timing matters, that acting too soon or too late can have disastrous consequences. It means recognizing that alignment matters, that working with the forces of nature, rather than against them, is essential for long-term survival. It means recognizing when persistence becomes exposure, when clinging to the past becomes a reckless gamble with the future. The story's final silence may be its most important feature, its most enduring legacy. Silence leaves room for reflection, allowing us to contemplate the implications of the story without dictating a specific outcome. It invites listening rather than demanding belief. In silence, attention shifts outward, to the land, to the sky, to the patterns of nature, and inward, to our own instincts, to our own sense of unease, to the subtle signals that something is changing, that a threshold is being approached. These signals are easy to ignore when life feels stable, when everything seems to be proceeding according to plan. They are far harder to ignore when stability fractures, when the foundations of our world begin to crumble. The inheritance carried forward from ancient catastrophe may not be a warning about sin or virtue, but an invitation to notice thresholds before they close, before it is too late to act. To notice when systems strain, rather than blindly assuming that they will automatically recover. To notice when staying requires more faith than leaving, when clinging to the familiar becomes a greater risk than embracing the unknown. This noticing does not guarantee survival. Nothing does. But it shapes our response, allowing us to react with greater wisdom and resilience in the face of adversity. Response, in the end, is all that remains when certainty dissolves, when the comfortable illusions of control are shattered. The story does not tell us how to prevent fire from falling from the sky. It tells us what survival looked like when it did movement, release, silence. These are not heroic qualities, the stuff of legends and epic poems. They do not inspire monuments or flatter our sense of identity. Yet, they have carried life forward more than once, allowing humanity to endure through countless trials and tribulations. If there is a final lesson embedded in the long echo of Sodom and Gomorrah, it may be this: that civilization endures not by denying vulnerability, but by remembering it without becoming paralyzed by fear, by holding stories lightly enough to adapt them to new circumstances, but seriously enough to listen to their underlying wisdom, by understanding that some knowledge is not meant to be spoken loudly, but to be felt as orientation, as a subtle sense of direction in a complex and ever-changing world, and by accepting that not every ending offers meaning, but every ending reshapes the terrain on which meaning will be sought next, creating new possibilities and new challenges. As the journey comes to rest here, there is no grand conclusion to draw, no definitive verdict to deliver, only a quiet awareness that history is not a straight and predictable path, but a series of thresholds, each representing a moment of decision, a point of no return. Some are crossed slowly, deliberately, with careful planning and foresight. Others are crossed in an instant, without warning, leaving us scrambling to adapt to a new reality. What matters is not whether thresholds exist, they are an inherent part of the human experience, but whether they are noticed before silence becomes the only response left, before the opportunity to act is irrevocably lost. And in that awareness, fragile and unfinished, the memory continues, not as fire, not as city, not as judgment, but as a question carried forward, passed down from generation to generation, asking each of us how closely we are listening to the ground beneath our feet, how attuned we are to the subtle signals of change, how willing we are to embrace movement when the time comes.